Chapter 26. 3 minutes later, Fan Xian took out a steaming fish plate and drizzled some expensive soy sauce from the south. The sauce was amber and very beautiful. The steamed fish mixed with the sauce, and the aroma immediately filled the kitchen. He found leftovers from the night before and ate them with the steamed fish, ginger, and vinegar. The next morning, he went to pay his respects to his grandmother. As he did so, a servant came to report that the kitchen had been visited by a thief. Fan Xian immediately understood what had happened and couldn't help but laugh. As he massaged the countess's shoulders, he said to the housekeeper, "I heated up some food last night. Don't be nervous." The servant was dumbfounded. The young master was so young, why didn't he ask the servants to do something? Why did he have to play with these things himself? If he burned someone, it would be no laughing matter. Fan Xian knew what the servant was thinking. He obediently said to the countess, "I recently found a way to steam fish in a book, so I wanted to try it myself. If it tasted good, I was going to give it to you. I wanted to give you a surprise, so I didn't dare let the servants know. I didn't expect it to alarm so many people. I know I was wrong." His words were reasonable, and most people wouldn't be able to find fault with them. The old mistress was expressionless when she heard this. She said gently, "Whatever you do is fine. Just remember to pack up properly no matter what you do." The countess had always been strict with Fan Xian. She rarely spoke in such a gentle tone, so Fan Xian felt a little uneasy. He felt that his grandmother's tone seemed to reveal a trace of pity for him. Why was that? The countess softly said, "I know what happened yesterday. Housekeeper Zhou wasn't very useful. You went into the kitchen at night, and no one noticed. That's really not right. I've already sent him back to the capital. Let that broken family deal with them." Fan Xian was slightly shocked. Only now did he remember that after he returned from killing someone, he had forgotten to deal with housekeeper Zhou. It was clear that the assassin had been able to sneak into the manor and poison it, and he had been so careless. It was indeed disappointing. During the day, Fan Xian was in no mood to read the books sent from the capital. When he left the manor again, he subconsciously passed by the market. Only then did he understand what his grandmother meant when she said, "No matter what you do, just remember to tidy up." A corner of the market had already been burned into ruins, but miraculously, it did not affect the neighboring buildings. Only the small building was burnt to a crisp, leaving nothing behind. Fan Xian, who was short, was listening to the conversation from the side. He knew that 2 people had been burned to death in the fire and were beyond recognition. The place that had been burned was the building where Fan Xian had killed people yesterday. Destroy the evidence. Fan Xian remembered that his grandmother had just said that she had sent housekeeper Zhou back to the capital. Connecting this with the wretched ashes in front of him, he suddenly felt a chill run through his body. He finally understood what had happened. He really did not think that his grandmother, who was too strict with him and didn't love him enough, would be so meticulous in her thinking. For the sake of her grandson's safety, she would do such a thing. Thinking of the old woman's normally closed eyes and resting appearance, Fan Xian could not connect this image with the ruins in front of him that were still giving off smoke. Fan Xian mingled in the crowd and looked at the charred remains of the black wood in front of him. He knew he had learned a few more things. Some of the nearby residents noticed his arrival. After greeting him, they were about to say something, but Fan Xian pretended not to hear them and left the market. Without realizing it, he had walked into the familiar grocery store. "The housekeeper has been sent back to the capital," said Fan Xian. Wu Zhu stood in the store, his body facing the quiet street. He did not react. The residents had all gone to the market to watch the excitement, so the street was very empty. "The small building we went to yesterday was burned," continued Fan Xian. Wu Zhu still did not react. Fan Xian grabbed the corner of his sleeve and said in a low voice, "Do you think I was stupid for forgetting to take care of housekeeper Zhou? And I need you to help me clean it up." Wu Zhu turned around and said, "Do you want me to pity you? Do you think you are young and do not know how to deal with these things, so your pride is hurt and you seek comfort?" There was a rare trace of curiosity in the blind man's voice. Compared to his usual emotionless voice, it was much more lively. Fan Xian laughed. "I don't have that extra pride. I just don't feel good about killing people." And he stopped talking. Deep down, he felt that if it weren't for Fei Jia and Wu Zhu's education, he would not have been more powerful than the children of the rich and powerful. Perhaps he would have died long ago. In this power struggle, in this secretive background, a little more knowledge did not seem to be of much use. Everyone who stood at the top of the waves of power was proficient in dirty and complicated methods. Compared to them, Fan Xian was really just a naive child. The feeling of killing people, or the feeling of being killed? "Which do you prefer?" asked Wu Zhu. Fan Xian did not know how to answer. Of course, no one wanted to be killed. "Since you already know the answer, then don't ask anymore." Wu Zhu handed him a sign. "Also, I think it is necessary to tell you that the Countess drove housekeeper Zhou out of Danzhou, but did not kill him, because she did not want the matter to become too serious in the capital." Fan Xian looked at the familiar sign and knew that it was the sign of the steward of the Count's household. This sign belonged to housekeeper Zhou. He raised his head and looked at Wu Zhu with confusion. "You killed him?" Wu Zhu nodded. Fan Xian suddenly thought of the identity of the assassin. He scratched his head and asked, why did the assassin's use of poison and follow-up methods resemble the methods of the Overwatch Council? Ask Fei Jia. On a bright and beautiful spring day in the west of Jingdou, in the square building with the outer walls painted a layer of gray and black, in his secret room, a thin, beardless old man sat in a wheelchair. His legs were covered by a soft, smooth, and beautiful wool blanket. The glass windows of the secret room were tightly covered with black cloth, not letting in a single ray of sunlight. This old man had been seriously ill many years ago in the north. Since then, he had been afraid of the light. "Old Fei, how is the investigation going on in Danzhou?" The old man looked at the white-haired, strange-looking man of the same age as him. He looked into his brown eyes and asked with a smile. Fei Jia sat in a chair and drank tea. Looking at the strange smile on the director's lips, he wondered who was the real old pervert. Chapter 27. Most of the government offices in the capital were concentrated in the area to the east of Tianhe Avenue. There were not many commoners living there, and the road was particularly wide. On both sides of the road were many beautiful or grand wooden buildings. These buildings were the scattered centers that controlled the power of the country. For example, the old military headquarters was located at the entrance of the road, with a giant stone lion. Every day, it faced the rising sun, baring its fangs and brandishing its claws. In the light and shadow, it looked strange, like a giant prehistoric beast. It did not reflect the military might of the Qin kingdom. The true center of power in the Qin kingdom was deep in the palace in the north of the city. The buildings in the palace were not as tall as the government offices, except for the watchtower that towered into the sky. However, the thick palace walls and the incomparably vast plaza created an extremely sacred feeling. The officials of the Kingdom of Qing all knew that the brilliant and astute emperor of the royal palace would not dwell on the specifics of officialdom. Thus, to them, the most terrifying place in the entire bureaucracy of the Kingdom of Qing, and the place with the most power, was neither the yamen nor the royal palace. It was the square building in the west of the city, with its outer walls painted with a layer of gray and black. It looked sinister and terrifying. The Overwatch Council was located there. The Qing kingdom implemented a system of 3 departments and 6 departments. The 3 departments were the Overwatch Council, the Ministry of Education, and the Ministry of Military Affairs, which had been upgraded from the old military headquarters. Of the 3 departments, the most powerful was the Overwatch Council. The Overwatch Council had the power of independent investigation, arrest, and, in some cases, trial. No other organization had the power to supervise it. In some sense, it was a wild beast without a leash. It was also like the Emperor's secret agency. No, it should be said that the Overwatch Council was a secret agency that the Emperor had placed in the open. However, the officials of the Qing kingdom were always deeply worried. The current emperor was talented and could subdue the sinister Director Qin and the Overwatch Council's countless secret agents and terrifying power. But, what if, in the future, who would pull the reins of this ferocious beast? Furthermore, the officials who had suffered under the Overwatch Council always cursed in their hearts. The Overwatch Council was not a wild beast, but a sinister and despicable wild dog. At that moment, in that dark room of the Overwatch Council, there was a quiet and secret conversation going on. The assassins in the Donzhou fire were indeed part of the council, and were under the jurisdiction of Dongshan Road. The 4th Bureau had always been in charge of the organization's affairs in other places. The Internal Affairs Division found out that an official of the 4th Division is a distant relative of the second wife of the master's family, so this mission should be arranged as such. Fei Jia looked at the director and said in a hoarse voice, "Identity." This was what the old man was most concerned about. Fei Jia squinted, his brown eyes full of uncertainty. "I believe that among the 8 people who know about this, no one will leak it. Although Master Wu was the lady's personal attendant, he rarely fought. Today, no one in the world has seen him in person. The only person he has met is Yi Luyun, who is now a grandmaster. It is even more impossible for him to travel to Donzhou. There are no such coincidences in this world, so there is no need to worry about others deducing his identity because of Master Wu." The director's fingers were thin and bony, his knuckles protruding. He gently tapped the table and said thoughtfully, "Back then, I wanted you to kill all the Black Knights who had seen Wu Zhu that night, and you pleaded with me. Now that I think about it, you were wrong." Fei Jie smiled. His eyes, which had become brown because of too much exposure to poison, flashed with an indescribable light. Many people died that night. Fei Jie, at least on the surface, did not seem to fear the old man in front of him. After all, his status and experience were there. He laughed and said in a hoarse voice, "Unnecessary killing is extremely stupid. Have you forgotten? The lady once said that." "Oh." The old man smiled as well, as if thinking of many happy things in the past. But in the midst of this smile, he issued a very sinister order. "Dongshan Road takes orders from the 4th Bureau. Since the documents are all signed, there is no mistake in the procedure, so Dongshan Road does not need to take responsibility for this matter. The others can be dealt with as they wish." He smiled and said to himself, "To use my power to kill the people I want to protect, is this a coincidence, or are some people testing something? That second wife, it seems, is not simple." He continued, "The 4th Bureau's Yan Ruohai did not supervise well, and signed the documents randomly. If it wasn't his own son, he would kill blindly and cause trouble. Stop his salary for 3 years, and send his eldest son, Yan Bingyun, to the north. He will only be allowed to return when he gets his hands on 2 high-grade goods." Having said this, the director picked up the document that the Ministry of Internal Affairs had already drafted, and wrote down the final conclusion. He then signed his name, Qin Pingping. Every time Fei Jie saw the director's shriveled and ugly signature, he wanted to laugh, but he had to hold it in. He knew that this feminine signature would cause the deaths of several high-ranking officials, and it would cause the son of an even higher-ranking official to miserably sneak into the enemy's country. He would only be allowed to return after obtaining particularly valuable information. This was probably even more terrifying than death. The old man laughed self-deprecatingly. I grew up with Fan Jian. I never thought I would have to worry so much about his family's affairs. Get someone to check if the second madam has any connection with that man. Fan Jian was Count Sinan's name, and he was Fan Xian's father. Fei Jia frowned, and his brown eyes trembled. Impossible. They must have thought that the baby died long ago. You misunderstand me. I also believe that they have no way of knowing that Fan Xian is the young lady's son. The director smiled. His Majesty has always requested that the nobility and civil officials keep their distance from us. Sending you to Danzhou all those years ago was done discreetly, but it was still possible that they would find out. Both the Empress Dowager and the Prime Minister are curious about the relationship between our council and Count Sinan. Those forces hiding in the dark are using the second wife's hand to test us and Sir Fan's reaction to this matter. It is only right that we do not overreact. Do you understand? Fei Jia suddenly had a suspicion. Regarding the assassination in Danzhou, perhaps it was because the director had purposely leaked some information. The old man pushed his wheelchair to the window, lifted a corner of the black cloth, and looked out. Also, regarding the matter of the chest, whether or not Wu Zhu is telling the truth, it is fine as long as it does not fall into the hands of our enemies in the north. It is a pity that we do not know how big the chest is, or what it looks like. Fei Jia came to his side and followed the old man's gaze out the window. When I go to hell, come play mahjong with me as soon as possible, Director Qin said with a smile. Fei Jia knew that the director was not as old as he appeared. I am a good man, he said with a smile. One day I will go to heaven. A black shadow floated out from the corner of the secret room like the wind. It pulled down the black cloth, blocking the overly strong sunlight from shining on the old man's body. This person's movements were soundless. It was the master who had killed the staff-wielding sorcerer outside the capital many years ago. Fei Jia pointed to the black shadow. I reckon he will come to play chess with you. Outside the window, the sun shone brightly. In the distance, the glazed tiles of the palace's halls shone with a deep golden light. As pedestrians passed by the entrance of the Overwatch Council, they unconsciously took a detour to the opposite side of the street, as if afraid of being contaminated by the gloomy atmosphere. At the entrance of the Overwatch Council was a wide stone tablet. On the tablet were a few sentences painted in gold. I hope that the people of the Kingdom of Qing will become uninhibited people. When abused by others, they will have a heart that will not yield. When attacked by evil, they will have a heart that will not be frustrated. When wrongdoing occurs, they will have a heart that will not be afraid to correct. They will not suck up to wolves and tigers. It was signed with 3 words, Yi Qingmei. No one knew who Yi Qingmei was, but all the citizens of the capital knew that when the Overwatch Council was established, this stone tablet had been erected there. It always shone with a golden light, resonating with the golden eaves of the palace in the distance. It seemed to hide all the darkness in those 2 buildings. Vote, vote, vote. Chapter 28. After experiencing an undercurrent of unrest, Danzhou harbor quickly regained its peace. No one paid any more attention to the relationship between Old Ha, who had been burned to death, and the other corpse in his building. As for the cause of the fire, the government did not give any explanation, and the ignorant commoners did not have any interest in the cause. Danzhou Harbor had always been a safe place. Under the strict control of the civil protection system, the criminals and adventurers who roamed the northern part of the Kingdom of Qing had no way of gaining any profit here. In addition, because the emperor had shifted the focus of trade to the south, he had exempted the 7 counties near Danzhou from taxes. Although it could not immediately make the people rich, it could at least ensure that every family had some surplus food. There would no longer be a refugee riot like 30 years ago because of the famine. Although Danzhou harbor was next to the sea, it was not affected by the volatile nature of the sea. The people in the city were very gentle, so when faced with the most distinguished family in the city, the Count's manor, they always showed the appropriate amount of respect and caution. Even though everyone knew that Fan Xian was an illegitimate child, they still called him young Master Fan, trying to suppress the slight disdain they might have felt for him. This was where Fan Xian's pain lay. In this life, other than showing off his talent as a spoiled brat in front of the ill-fated housekeeper Zhou, he had never had the opportunity to play this role again. Walking on the streets of Danzhou harbor, some people were friendly to him, some were respectful, but no one provoked him. The Jinqi in his body slowly accumulated, strengthening his meridians. Most of the Jinqi that had been lost to the snow-capped mountain behind his back was quiet, and he did not know what use it was there. In this life, Fan Xian had always played the role of a steady and knowledgeable youth. But after living like this for so long, he always felt a little stifled. Moreover, after knowing that he was strong enough to kill an assassin, he looked forward to doing something heroic, standing up for justice, and saving a beautiful woman. But Danzhou harbor was peaceful, too peaceful. The study was lit with calming incense, and the faint fragrance was soothing. Fan Xian held a delicate brush in his hand, and on the rice paper that was cut to the size of 4 palms, he wrote earnestly. Nowadays, the literary world was divided into the modern school and the ancient school. When it came to using brushes, there were also those who used a goose feather and those who used a brush. From a more convenient point of view, using a goose feather might be better, so the various yamen in Jingdou usually used this kind of brush, including when Fei Jia was teaching in Danzhou. However, the craft of sharpening the nib of a quill required a truly skilled master. The nib would easily deform if used for a long time, so it would not be easy to promote it. Fan Xian preferred a writing brush. First, he felt that since this world happened to use square characters, the words written with a writing brush would, of course, be more beautiful. He decided to practice his calligraphy so that he wouldn't embarrass himself in the future. On the other hand, he believed that a story like the one he was writing now must be copied slowly with a brush and beautiful small regular script to show respect. His personal servant girl, Cici, used 2 slender fingers to hold a piece of ink and slowly and evenly ground it clockwise in the inkstone. Her eyes fell on the paper in front of the young master, and on it was written. Saw Jining alone in the room washing tea bowls. Qin Zhong ran over and kissed her. Jining anxiously stamped his feet and said, "What is this? If you do this again, I will scream." Qin Zhong begged, "Good man, I am dying of anxiety. If you don't comply today, I will die here." "Jining, what do you want?" "I will only comply when I get out of this prison and away from these people." Qin Zhong, "That is easy, but distant water cannot quench present thirst." Cici glanced at the unbearable content written on the paper and couldn't help but blush. How can this Jining be so shameless? Fan Xian heard the servant girl's angry voice and raised his head curiously. He asked with a smile, "Sister, why do you say Jining is shameless?" When he was in the room or somewhere no one was paying attention, he would always call the head servant girl's sister. This habit had continued since Dong-er. The servant girls couldn't dissuade him, and the old mistress didn't care, so they could only let him be. After all these years, he had long gotten used to it and didn't think it was strange. Cici's blush spread out like the morning clouds. It was very beautiful. She explained in a low voice that her words and actions are too impetuous and frivolous. "But young master, what is a nun? And what kind of place is the Manta nunnery?" Fan Xian chuckled, thinking that when he wrote about Qin Zhong and Jining's illicit relationship later, she would probably feel that he was really impetuous. But when he heard Cici ask what a nun was, he remembered that there was no Buddhism in this world. Naturally, there were no monks, and there were no female monks. He scratched his head with his empty hand, not knowing how to explain. After a long time, he forced out a sentence. Nuns are like ascetic monks, and the Manton nunnery is like a temple. Hearing his explanation, Cece was shocked. Young master, you don't dare to write nonsense. The temple is located in the misty sky. It has always been compassionate to the people of the world, and it doesn't meddle in worldly affairs. How could it be such a dirty place? Fan Xian didn't explain to her. He smiled and said, I know. I'll just be careful when I write. After writing a few more sentences, he thought of something and had Cece leave. He didn't want the servant girls to see the content that was not suitable for children and report it to the old mistress. When he was young, he often told stories to scare Dong-er. Dong-er always thought that it was the teacher who taught him. Later, she really did complain to the old mistress, causing Fan Xian to read silently for a few days. Cece gave him a few careful reminders, put down the ink in her hand, and pushed open the door. Before she left, her graceful posture made Fan Xian's heart slightly warm. Fan Xian held the brush in his hand and pondered, thinking that copying Dream of the Red Chamber was indeed much more complicated than plagiarizing the poems of the predecessors. He had started writing a year ago, and until now, he had only written 15 chapters from memory. Fortunately, his mind was now strangely clear, and the memory of his previous life was not the slightest bit off. In fact, it was even clearer. It was thanks to this that he could remember Chao Shuichin's beautiful, but actually difficult to remember poems in his sleep. But the background of the characters in the book was always somewhat different from this world. He didn't know if others would understand when they read it in the future, so there were some important parts that needed to be slowly changed. But Fan Xian still had great confidence in his Dream of the Red Chamber. A cow, led to Beijing, would still be a cow. Dream of the Red Chamber. In this world, it would still be Dream of the Red Chamber, and it would still be a cow. Chapter 29. He really envied the times when he was studying in his previous life. He had fantasized about reading at night, so he had dragged Cece along to accompany him to write for half a day. Smelling the incense in the room, the fragrance of a woman's body, and the soft brush tip touching the paper, he enjoyed the wonderful feeling of tranquility. But he was afraid that if word got out that he was writing a book, it would bring him a lot of unnecessary trouble. So he decided to quietly write on his own in the future. Fan Xian always felt that he had to prepare for his future life in the capital, both materially and spiritually. And for a long story like Dream of the Red Chamber, it was impossible to be like plagiarizing a poem and blurt it out at a banquet. So it had to be prepared in advance. For some reason, he always felt that his future life would be inextricably linked to the heart of the kingdom of Qin, the faraway capital. Perhaps it would be his father who was a high-ranking official in the court, or perhaps it would be the silly little girl in his mind, or perhaps it would be his mother who he had never met, but was always curious about. He thought for a while, then put pen to paper and finished writing about the unspeakable things about Bao Yu and Qin Zhong'er. When the ink dried, he put it in an envelope, ready to mail it to Fan Ruoruo in the capital. Fan Xian did not keep any manuscripts in his mansion in Danzhou. Every time he wrote one, he would send it to the capital. Because it was really difficult for him to suppress his desire to share the beautiful experiences of his previous life with the people of this world. It was like someone who possessed the most beautiful jade in the world, one that no one had ever seen before, and hid it under his bed for many years. His heart must be itching to die, and he would always want to let the whole world know, at least one person, know of the breathtaking beauty of the jade. A collector who kept a famous painting for a lifetime and never showed it to anyone, if he was not a pervert, then he was a thief who stole the painting. And Fan Xian knew that he was definitely not a pervert. Although he was indeed a thief, the wonderful thing was that no one in the world knew about it. So Fan Xian completely ignored Fan Ruoro's age and sent her the manuscripts every month. He told her that the story was called Story of the Stone, and that it was written by a man named Xiao Shuaqin, whom he had met by chance. Every month, he would get a few manuscripts from him to share with his sister, and so on. Although in the first 15 chapters of Dream of the Red Chamber, Qin Keqing met Baoyu in her dreams and Baoyu had his first love affair, Fan Xian was certain that the little girl, under the influence of his letters for so many years, would not see it as a scourge or a ferocious beast, nor would she see her brother as a perverted person. Sure enough, when Fan Ruoro received Grandmaster Chao's writing, she read it ignorantly and chewed it as if it was a peony. She slowly tasted some flavor, especially after she saw Dayu enter the mansion. She began to feel good. Every month she would write letters to her brother urging him to ask more from Grandmaster Chao. When Fan Xian received the letter, he couldn't help but feel depressed. Now that the manuscript was gone, he couldn't update it too quickly. In the future, when he copied 70 or 80 chapters, he would still end up as a eunuch. After finishing his task of plagiarizing for the day, Fan Xian began to read as usual. There were many miscellaneous books in his study, all of which had been sent by the Count in the capital. Every time he thought of this, his impression of his father, whom he had never met, would change. At least his father knew what was most important in the process of a person's growth. In a country without AV or scams, the only way Fan Xian could distract himself from his boring life, other than playing hide-and-seek with the powerful Jinqi in his body every day and making the maids blush in embarrassment, was to read the miscellaneous books in the study. The contents of the books covered a wide range of topics, from farming to the laws of the kingdom of Qing. There was nothing that was not covered. There were also some scriptures from this world, which filled the entire bookshelf like bricks. Fan Xian had made this bookshelf according to the style he had in mind. It was a very simple design. Each layer was filled with rue grass from Yaozhou. This grass was the best at preventing moths from corroding books. However, few people in this world knew about it, so it was only used as a common perfume in the manor. After reading these books for many years, Fan Xian discovered many traces of what he had learned in his previous life. The only difference was in the way they were expressed. This understanding made him put an end to the idea of plagiarizing Han Fizi, Xuanzi, Laozi, Sun Tzu, and Sun Tzu to become a great scholar. No matter what aspect of learning, whether it was poison discerning, cultivation, or reading, Fan Xian was very serious. With a steadiness and hard work that did not match his age, he continued to accumulate knowledge. This was because he understood that he was not much more than other people. He had not come to a perfect world with an average IQ of 50. The only advantages he had were the little bit of knowledge that had settled down in society on Earth, and the fact that he had awakened much earlier than most children. There was a light sound from the oil lamp, and a small ball of flame jumped out. It suddenly became a little brighter. Fan Xian bent over the table and read, gradually falling asleep. The next morning, after waking up and washing up, Fan Xian first went to the old lady's bedroom to pay his respects before going to the hall for breakfast. Ever since the incident with the assassins, the way Fan Xian looked at his grandmother was very different from before. Apart from the morning and afternoon greetings that he had insisted on for many years, he would often chat with his kind-looking grandmother, telling her a few jokes to make her happy. I heard that one day, His Majesty summoned the Prime Minister, the consular ministers of the Council of Elders, the director of the Overwatch Council, the head of the palace eunuchs, and a group of high-ranking officials to the Great Hall to discuss state affairs. In the end, a meteor fell from the sky and smashed through the roof of the hall, crushing all the ministers who were kneeling below. His Majesty hurriedly summoned the imperial physician, who was waiting outside the sick room. Not long after, the imperial physician came out. His Majesty asked, "Imperial physician, can the Prime Minister be saved?" The imperial physician shook his head, the Prime Minister cannot be saved." At the beginning of the joke, the old lady's face was full of suspicion. She did not know why the child was talking about the affairs of the capital. She had personally experienced the treacherous aspects of power, so she had always been cautious. His Majesty asked, "What about the consular ministers?" The imperial physician shook his head dejectedly. "Alas, they cannot be saved." His Majesty asked, "Eunuch Hong?" The imperial physician still shook his head. His Majesty was furious, and shouted, "Then who can be saved?" The imperial physician's spirits rose, and he said, "Your Majesty, the kingdom of Qing can be saved." Hearing the last sentence, the old woman suddenly woke up. She laughed so hard that she almost cried. Pointing at Fan Xian's innocent face, she laughed and scolded him. "You little mischievous brat. If this was in the capital, you'd be arrested by the Overwatch Council for this joke." Chapter 30. Although the kingdom of Qing was unparalleled in power, it could not completely eliminate the evils of the court. In the hearts of the common people, the most treacherous officials were the Prime Minister, the Consular Minister, and the head of the eunuchs, Eunuch Hong. Of course, the director of the Overwatch Council was also notorious, but Fan Xian could not bring him into the mix because of his relationship with Fei Jia. This joke was actually derived from a joke about the political situation in Taiwan in his previous life. Fan Xian had written it to his sister in a letter, and it had amused her greatly. Today, he told his grandmother about it, and the seemingly muddle-headed, but actually very shrewd, old woman laughed uncontrollably. Having amused the most powerful woman in Danzhou Harbor, Fan Xian reported to his grandmother that he would be going out for a while. His grandmother rarely interfered with his affairs, and had already returned to being as calm as an ancient well. She only lightly grunted in acknowledgement. After leaving the manor, Fan Xian thought of his grandmother, who had grown closer to him, and felt gratified. After all, his grandmother had taken care of him in every possible way. Thinking of this, he could not help but recall a rumor. He had heard that the Fan family had always been a prominent family in the capital, but his father, Count Sinan, was a distant concubine with few children, so they were often bullied. Not long after his grandmother gave birth to Count Sinan, she entered King Cheng's manor and became a wet nurse, something that most noble families would never do. Coincidentally, the previous emperor didn't have any children, so after he died young due to having too much sex, one of the two imperial princes who were most likely to inherit the throne was assassinated by a Northern Wei assassin, and the other was assassinated by someone sent by the previous prince who had already been assassinated. Damn, in short, after such a complicated and absurd process, that unremarkable throne that could easily cause one to bleed while sitting on it, was pushed under the butt of King Qing, who had always been cautious and self-restrained. King Qing was the peaceful emperor for a few years. When the time came, he ascended to heaven, and the throne was passed on to the current emperor. Under the emperor's leadership, the entire kingdom of Qing conquered the barbarians to the west and Northern Wei to the north. Finally, the world was in chaos, and the once powerful Northern Wei fell apart. It became Northern Qi, a few small vassal states, and the city of Dongyi, which had always been uninvolved. Regarding the emperor, there was nothing more than the weight of his martial arts and literary achievements in the annals of history. The current emperor of the Kingdom of Qing could be considered the best since the founding of the Kingdom of Qing in terms of martial arts. Thus, a group of ministers had long ago submitted petitions asking the emperor to go to Deyue Mountain to pray for blessings on his behalf. But for some reason, the emperor had refused, and had even beaten a few sycophantic ministers who believed that the emperor was merely fishing for praise and retreating in order to advance. The old woman in Count Sinan's manor was the wet nurse of this decisive and powerful emperor, who had always been hidden in the depths of the palace. A few years ago, Fan Xian had always had some doubts about his father. Count Sinan's secret power was at odds with his current position in the capital, and yet he was able to make Fei Jia of the Overwatch Council his teacher. But now that he knew that his grandmother was the emperor's wet nurse, his doubts were immediately dispelled. His father, Count Sinan, was somewhat similar to the Jiangning weaver Chao Yin from before the reign of Kangxi in his previous life. Chao Yin's mother, Lady Sun, was Kangxi's nanny, so from then on Chao Yin was favored by Kangxi for the rest of his life. Although he was only a small official, he held the power to report secret memorials. When Kangxi toured the south, the Chao family received him at home several times. Who in the entire Jiangnan officialdom did not fear him? Even in Kangxi's later years, when Chao Yin was investigated for having run a deficit in the national treasury, Kangxi delayed and exempted him for the sake of their old friendship. It was not until after Chao Yin's death that their relationship became distant, and the Chao family fell into misfortune. Thus, Chao Shuiqin went to Beijing at the age of 18, and there was Dream of the Red Chamber. Only then could Fan Xian plagiarize Dream of the Red Chamber. Mr. Chao, it seems that although we live in two different places, we are indeed of one heart. This book of mine is quite fitting. Fan Xian thought of his family's situation similar to the Chao family's, and couldn't help but smile. He lightly flicked the envelope with the 10th chapter of Story of the Stone in his hand, and walked out of the manor. On the cliff by the sea, Fan Xian closed his eyes and meditated. His entire body entered a very mysterious feeling. Because he had been a passive materialist in his previous life, he was able to be entangled with this tyrannical Jinqi in this life. He had a dreamlike feeling. It was somewhat similar to falling in love. Falling in love always had its ups and downs, and the tyrannical Jinqi he cultivated made him feel both happy and sad at the same time. It was clear that this tyrannical Jinqi had caused his body to undergo some very miraculous changes, such as his strength and reflexes. But often it would not listen to him, and it would always put him in danger. These past few years, because Wu Zhu had hammered him, the Jinqi had become much more well-behaved. But today was a dangerous juncture, because today was the last day of training in the tyrannical scroll. Wu Zhu stood quietly to one side, watching Fan Xian sit cross-legged with his palms facing the sky. His hand held the ordinary-looking wooden stick neither too tightly nor too loosely. With a thought, the Jinqi that had been accumulated in his dantian began to slowly circulate. Under the guidance of his divine sense, it followed the meridians of his chest and abdomen and dispersed in all directions. The Jinqi that escaped from the qi acupoints sank into the snowy mountains of his kidneys, just as it had done for the past 10 years. There was no trace of it left. But the rest of the Jinqi still maintained a strong amount, rushing through his meridians like countless small heated knives, carefully scraping the soft walls of his meridians. Fan Xian's whole body trembled, and cold sweat soaked his clothes. His eyes were tightly shut, and his long eyelashes trembled incessantly. He was enduring the incomparable pain. He had cultivated the tyrannical scroll for 12 years, and even the most difficult stage of entering the tyrannical scroll, he had easily passed it by sleeping. Since then, there had been no more difficult areas. Who would have thought that breaking through the first scroll would be so difficult? The Jinqi was still rampaging through the meridians of his chest and abdomen, constantly scouring the meridians. This kind of sharp scouring could widen the meridians and increase the speed of the Jinqi circulation, but it was accompanied by a huge destructive power. The power that could widen the invisible meridians brought pain to the divine sense, and it was not easy to endure. Fortunately, 12 years of hard training had made the strength of Fan Xian's meridians very sturdy, so the Jinqi did not overflow the walls of his meridians and cause unimaginable tragic consequences. And with the help of his strange life of 2 lives, his mental strength was much stronger than the average person's. It seemed like a long time had passed. In fact, the morning sun on the eastern sea had just left the embrace of the sea not long ago. It stopped horizontally in the distance, emitting a warm red light. It shone on the cliff, reflecting 2 lonely figures, one standing and one sitting. The Jinqi flowed against the flow, and that vast and ruthless aura finally broke through the obstruction of the meridians in his body. It went straight from the chi acupoint to the sky, and like a large knife, it fiercely chopped toward the center of Fan Xian's forehead. In the red sunlight, Fan Xian felt as if he had been struck by lightning. He raised his head and looked at the sky above his head. His mouth was wide open, but he could not make a sound. Chapter 31. Take off your clothes. The wooden stick in Wu Zhu's hand struck Fan Xian's head with a loud bang. At that moment, the Jinqi in Fan Xian's forehead was rushing toward the ceiling. He could vaguely see a bright light in his spiritual sense, especially the top of his head, which had turned into a rainbow color. But it was a bit sticky, and he couldn't see it clearly. A wave of annoyance spread out from the blockage, making Fan Xian very vexed and depressed. He could only raise his head to the sky, wanting to feel better. At that moment, the Jinqi in front of his forehead was struck by Wu Zhu's stick. The rod struck his body, but it was more like striking the depths of his soul, making his mind explode. It was as if the dark clouds in the sky above his head were split apart by a bolt of lightning, and the clear and beautiful sunlight sprinkled down just like that. Take off your clothes. This was a passage from the 5 classics of Qing, the old sayings. It was said that one of the 4 great grandmasters of the present day, Ku He's great-grandmaster, Zhen Qin, had once been taught by Meng Tian. When he was enlightened, he shouted that the human body was like a sweatshirt. Only by taking it off could one achieve great things. And in the books that Fan Xian had read in his previous life, Buddhism also spoke of the way of discipline. Zen master Qin Yuan once said, "Only when the sweatshirt is taken off will one know the way of discipline be foolishness." So when Fan Xian heard Wu Zhu's words, he understood what it meant. The passage above his head had been cleared, and the sky was shining down. His mind was clear again, and he focused on his internal organs. He treated all the pain in his meridians as if it were inflicted by the heavens and others, and had nothing to do with him. To let go of all the attachments in life, to let go of all the sensations in the body, was just the right state of mind for the final stage of the scroll of domination. The qi of the heavens and the earth could not be contained by a single person's body. Only by abandoning one's own body and connecting oneself with the qi of the heavens and the earth, becoming a part of nature, could one draw upon such violent and untamable jinqi. The jinqi in Fan Xian's body gradually calmed down. The passage above his head had been opened, and the gentle but vigorous jinqi flowed through it, then flowed down the pillar behind him, directly into the snow-capped mountain. What was even more amazing was that the snowy mountain, which had always been as calm as the sea, had undergone some small changes today. Some vital energy began to seep out and replenish his dantian. In this way, the circulation of vital energy in his body was finally unobstructed, forming a perfect circular channel that faintly resonated with the external environment. After a long time, Fan Xian woke up in a daze. A puddle of dirty water had long since seeped out of his body. It was black and smelly. He looked at Wu Zhu, who still had a cold expression on his face, and gave a weak smile. He smiled bitterly and said, "Thank you, uncle. It's just that, your blow was really vicious." At this moment, although his body felt weak, his spirit was very vigorous. He closed his eyes to examine the condition of his body and familiarize himself with the new flow of his true qi. He felt that although the originally violent true qi was still strong, it was clearly not as dry as before. It circulated more freely and freely. Fan Xian sighed. He had never imagined that he would finally be able to practice Shinqi, which he had only seen in wuxia novels in his previous life. An indescribable feeling filled his mind, and he subconsciously slapped his right hand to the side. There was a muffled sound, like a rag being cut open by a red-hot iron wire. A shallow palm print appeared on the ground, the edges very smooth. Fan Xian raised his right hand and looked at it, then lowered his head to look at the palm print on the stone. He measured its size, confirming that he had casually slapped it. After staring blankly for a long time, he finally came to his senses and sighed. It really is amazing. Jinchi overflowed. It will be fine in a moment, Wu Zhu said beside him. Uncle, didn't you say that you had never practiced Jinchi before, so you didn't know how to teach me? I've seen others practice it, so I know what to do today. So you've never eaten pork, but you've seen pigs run. Fan Xian suddenly felt like he was scolding himself. He smiled and continued. That was really dangerous. If it weren't for that blow, I'm afraid I would have become a vegetable again. What is a vegetable? Wu Zhu asked calmly. Fan Xian looked up at the sky, his mind wandering, ignoring him. He immediately realized that the blind Wu Zhu was also an empiricist. Then, what if that blow didn't knock him out, and instead knocked him unconscious? The violent Jinchi in his body would run amok, turning his internal organs into a mess. Shuddering, he shook off this incomparably terrifying association. Looking at the vast sea in front of him, his heart felt at ease. Now that he had achieved the first stage of his cultivation method, he was secretly excited and finally got rid of the gloomy mood from the assassination incident a few days ago. These past few days, Fan Xian had not understood why the assassin would actually use poison. When Fei Jia came to teach him how to recognize and detoxify poisons, did he really know that this day would come? That was a little too far-sighted and farsighted. Also, that second aunt was too daring. Even if she had the support of some noble family in the capital, using the method of poisoning was equivalent to saying that she did not care about grandmother's life. That old woman was the emperor's wet nurse. Did his father in the capital not notice this at all? As he pondered these questions, he heard a song coming from the cliff in the distance. This cliff was close to the sea, far away from Danzhou. Behind the cliff was a barren land, and in front of the cliff was a forest of rocks. Fishing boats could not get close, so it was very quiet. It was for this reason that Wu Zhu chose to teach Fan Xian a killing technique. So hearing the song today, Fan Xian could not help but feel puzzled. Although he was nervous, he did not lose his composure. Carefully lying on the cliff, separated by a rock, he looked in the direction of the song. As far as his eyes could see, in the raging waves, a small boat was traveling among the black rocks. The black rocks were faintly discernible in the white foam, and the boat swayed leisurely among them. It looked as if it could crash into the rocks at any moment and break into pieces. But just like that, the small boat was able to move forward with ease. There was a man sitting on the boat, wearing a bamboo hat. The song came from his mouth. The waves only bloom for a moment, but they are no different from rocks that have lived for thousands of years. The same goes for the flowing clouds. The song was gentle, but it could be clearly heard above the roar of the waves. Hearing this song, Fan Xian thought of the famous line from his previous life, Satonori Matsunaga, praising the morning glory. The morning light only bloom for a quarter of an hour, but they are no different from a pine tree that has lived for thousands of years. He felt that the person on the boat was very elegant but also unfathomable. As he was thinking, he heard Wu Zhu's cold voice. Hide! Fan Xian unconsciously hid his body behind the rock. He felt a black shadow flash past him, and then he watched in horror as Wu Zhu jumped off the cliff, which was hundreds of feet high. Chapter 32. Before he had cultivated the tyrannical Jinchi, he would never have believed that a human body could be harder than stone. But after his palm left a palm print on the stone, he gave up on that idea. Still, he did not believe that someone could jump off a cliff hundreds of feet high and come out unscathed, especially without slowing down in the process. Wu Zhu helped him overturn that idea, and at the same time gave him a great shock. It turned out that the true strength of this world's superpowers was so terrifying. The black cloth covering Wu Zhu's eyes turned into a strange and beautiful black thread as he fell at high speed. His body was like a lightning-fast arrow, stomping toward the small boat. He did not use any lightness skills. He simply allowed the gravity of the earth to pull him down. Over a distance of hundreds of feet, he continued to accelerate. By the time he reached the bow of the boat, he had reached a speed that would leave anyone dumbfounded. His body cut through the air, moving even faster than the wind. It made a terrifying buzzing sound. The power he carried with him reached the boat before his body, and he suddenly tore off the singer's bamboo hat. The hat flew off and fell far into the sea, revealing the singer's face. The singer's features were simple and unsophisticated, and his eyes were as calm as the autumn waters. Seeing the pair of feet coming down from above, his pupils shrank, and a bright light flashed. A pair of white, jade-like hands gently danced outside the sleeves. Like withered twigs sprouting, the knuckles spread open. Countless waves of qi shot out from the singer's fingertips. Before Wu Zhu could crash into the boat, the qi shot into the unending waves of the sea, pushing the boat back 2 steps in the white waves. It was in these 2 steps that Wu Zhu smashed into the bow of the boat like a rock from the heavens, but not into the singer's body. Before the sound of the wind had even arrived, Wu Zhu's feet had already landed on the front of the boat. This kind of power from the heavens was not something a small boat could withstand. There was a loud crash. The entire boat was pushed into the sea by this great force. Its stern rose up high, and it quickly plunged into the sea. The singer was thrown into the air by the recoil. He spread his hands in the air, looking a little embarrassed. Water splashed everywhere as the bow of the ship was shattered by the powerful impact and sank to the bottom of the sea. A black shadow broke through the surface of the water. Amidst the splashing water, it followed the fluttering singer in the air. In an instant, its finger was like a sword, ruthlessly stabbing towards the singer's throat. The singer crossed his hands. His sanzhou was like the beams of a house, stable and beautiful. He barely managed to block Wu Zhu's killing blow. A series of light explosions rang out in the air. This was the result of the collision between the 2 forces. It was unknown how many moves these 2 peerless experts had made in such a short period of time. A moment later, the 2 figures quickly separated and landed on both sides of the extremely narrow beach at the bottom of the cliff. On the surface of the sea, the debris of the boat slowly floated to the surface, looking like the residue in a Chinese medicine jar. Only half of the boat's stern was left floating without an owner, looking very miserable. "The assassination failed, so you'll have to pay for my boat fare," the singer said with a smile, looking at the black cloth covering Wu Zhu's eyes. Having said this, he extended his hand towards Wu Zhu from a distance as if he was going to demand compensation from him. He was 30 feet away from Wu Zhu, but as soon as he extended his hand, Wu Zhu frowned. He quickly took 2 steps back and leaned his body to the side, avoiding the direction the singer's finger was pointing in. There was a rustling sound, and the sand where Wu Zhu had been standing was densely packed, just like the line in the poem, 10,000 holes in the sand when the rain hits the sand. Separated by a distance of 30 feet, with a light wave of his hand, the force penetrated the sand. There were not many people in the world with this level of cultivation. "Why are you here?" Wu Zhu tilted his head slightly. Although his face showed no expression, it was clear that he was much more cautious than usual. "I fought with you 16 years ago. Since then, I haven't found a worthy opponent," the singer replied with a smile. "Last year, I went back to the capital. Yi Chong said that he couldn't find you after all these years. I thought you really went to another world with Miss Yi. I couldn't help but drink 2 cans of wine, one of which I poured on the ground and shed 2 drops of tears. This year, I'm traveling again. Just now, I felt a strong aura on the surface of the sea, so I came to take a look. I didn't expect it to be you. The singer sighed angrily. I haven't seen you for more than 10 years. Why do you want to kill me? You know that I can't kill you, and you can't kill me. Wu Zhu tilted his head in thought, as if acknowledging this fact. The singer knew that this blind man had a strange temperament. If he could kill him, he might actually do so. He couldn't help but smile. After Miss Yi left, I thought you would return to the temple. Why did you come to Danzhou Harbor? You know why I want to kill you. Wu Zhu didn't answer. Instead, he said coldly, in this world, only a few people know me, and among them, you are the one with the biggest mouth. The singer looked embarrassed. He didn't know how to answer. Wu Zhu continued, so if I can kill you and shut you up, I'd be happy to do it. The singer shook his head with a bitter smile. You still have that terrible temper. It's rare to see someone like you who still loves to kill, even at our level of cultivation. Wu Zhu shook his head. I only care about the results, not the means. He suddenly frowned. Since you found someone you're interested in, let's go. The singer paused for a moment, then laughed heartily. He cupped his fists and said with a smile, actually, I'm not a talkative person. After saying this, he waved his short sleeves, clasped his hands behind his back, and confidently floated onto the half of the short boat on the surface of the sea. He didn't know how the boat was made, but it was still able to float with only half of it left. He stood on the wreckage of the boat and used his hands to make a rowing motion. In such a comical manner, he used his internal strength to propel the wreckage of the boat toward Danzhou. Wu Zhu looked in the direction he left, his black cloth fading. Who is he? Fan Xian, who had climbed down from the peak, didn't hear the conversation between the two strong men. He was still shocked by the battle he had just witnessed. Yi Luyun. As expected. Fan Xian sighed and followed Wu Zhu in the direction of Danzhou. Chapter 33. Yi Luyun came and then left. He really was like the clouds that flowed everywhere in the sky, not leaving a single trace. The citizens of Danzhou had no idea that one of the 4 grandmasters, whom they often spoke of in reverence, had come to Danzhou to drink, fight, and sing. Wu Zhu was a little worried. There were not many people in the world who knew of his relationship with the lady, but Yi Luyun was one of them. He was a famous blabbermouth, completely at odds with his status as a grandmaster. Yi Luyun's visit to Danzhou was too strange. Wu Zhu did not believe that he had left after meeting with him. Fan Xian, however, believed that Yi Luyun was indeed a simple traveler. He patted Wu Zhu on the shoulder and comforted him. Who says masters can't travel? It was just a very pure intuition. His intuition had always been accurate, and he had always felt that there was something wrong with his father in the capital. The Overwatch Council, the assassin, and the second wife, who was braver than a tigress. So he believed that his father, Count Sinan, was not as simple as he appeared. At the very least, he was much more formidable than Chao Yin, a lackey. But his train of thought had gone completely astray. He wondered if his father was the illegitimate son of the previous emperor, King Qing. Because his grandmother had been a wet nurse in King Cheng's manor, the old emperor had taken her home to raise her. Now, because Count Sinan was heartbroken over his birth, and hated the fact that his half-brother sat on the throne while he himself could only be a small count, he played the pig to eat the tiger. Secretly, he colluded with the Overwatch Council and all the reactionary forces he could use to organize a group of secret forces, vainly hoping to take over all of His Majesty's property. And Fan Xian. Because his mother was unquestionably an important person, he had become the product of some kind of family marriage. Fan Xian's existence was very important to his father's great cause of rebellion. When he told Wu Zhu about the conjectures he had come up with when he was bored, Wu Zhu, who had always been unflinching even in the face of an avalanche, could not help but fiercely chop the kitchen knife in his hand into the chopping board, expressing a certain degree of respect for a certain young man's crazy imagination. It was precisely because of this that Wu Zhu decided to temporarily not take him away from Danzhou. Since the crazy youth was not worried about the future, and kept his shy, curious smile on his face, ready at any moment to throw himself into the illusory Count Sinan's rebellion, and seemingly indifferent to the dangers that such a fallacy could bring, what did blind Wu Zhu have to fear? Wu Zhu had never worried about his own safety. He only worried about Fan Xian. And if Fan Xian appeared to be extremely perverted and unworried, Wu Zhu would let him be, just like when Fan Xian started drinking at the age of 5. Wu Zhu was only responsible for protecting Fan Xian's safety, and would not take the initiative to give too much advice. Deep down, this pair of master and servant, this pair of master and disciple, were both very lazy and audacious people. It was not that they did not know how to plot, but they felt that sometimes force in their hands was more powerful than plots. Therefore, they subconsciously regarded other people's plots as trivial matters. So what if they came, what else could they do? The so-called bright moon great river, the so-called cool breeze mountain ridge. Actually, Fan Xian was not the bright moon, but the bashful crescent eyebrows. He was still afraid of death, because he did not have Wu Zhu's peerless skills. But he knew that if he had Fei Jia of the Overwatch Council behind him, and this blind servant at his side, then even if he wanted to die, it would not be so easy. After personally witnessing Wu Zhu's battle with Yi Luyun, one of the 4 great grandmasters, he was deeply shaken. When it came to matters of martial arts, he finally understood the beauty of the way of tea and calligraphy, the beauty of art. So for the time being, he stopped copying Dream of the Red Chamber and devoted himself to cultivation. Wu Zhu himself did not have any brilliant sword or fish techniques, but he had done a lot of research on how to kill a person. He was particular about speed, accuracy, straightforwardness, and ruthlessness. He once said to Fan Xian, "Do not believe in the theory that you can attack or retreat in a perfect arc. If you want to attack your opponent, then you must walk in a straight line, with the fastest speed, the shortest distance, and inflict irreversible damage on your opponent." Fan Xian immediately thought of that day when Wu Zhu had jumped straight off the cliff. He thought that Wu Zhu had indeed walked the shortest distance. He smiled bitterly and shook his head. He did not know how long he would have to wait to reach that level. One day, after the shredded radish lesson, Fan Xian waved his slightly numb right arm. He looked at Wu Zhu, who had his back to him, and asked curiously, "According to what I said before, what level am I at now?" "Level 7 Jinqi, level 3 control ability." Fan Xian quickly calculated in his mind. "On average, you are level 5, a little higher than level 4. I can get my graduation certificate." The young man was slightly proud, and his beautiful eyes were slightly arrogant. Wu Zhu shook his head. "If you are lucky enough, you can kill a level 7 character. If you are unlucky enough, then a level 3 thief could end your life." Fan Xian smiled and sighed. This young uncle was really direct. But it seemed that his luck had always been good, otherwise he would not have come to this world after his death. After Yi Luyun's visit, Fan Xian's life in Danzhou became truly peaceful. No more assassins came looking for trouble. It was said that the second wife had been seriously ill, so she became much more well-behaved. In the capital, Fan Ruoro still sent a letter every month. Fan Xian stayed in this small seaside town, eating tofu and copying small books. Occasionally, he would wear colorful clothes to show filial respect to the old lady, go to the grocery store to drink, and cut up shredded radishes to go with the wine. His days were very leisurely. One day, a mirage appeared on the seashore. The residents of Danzhou Harbor all ran out to see what was going on. Although they lived by the seashore for a long time, seeing the illusory, fairyland-like islands on the horizon still excited them greatly. Wu Zhu became strange. He closed the door of the grocery store and walked to the remote seaside. Alone, he climbed up a cliff and quietly watched the scene, as if remembering something that made him very unhappy. The mirage did not last long. After a while, it disappeared, but he still quietly watched the scene. Looking through the black cloth, it was as if he was not blind. Fan Xian climbed up the cliff. His naked upper body was very well proportioned, and he had already shed his skinny figure. He looked at Wu Zhu sitting there quietly. Not daring to disturb him, he also sat down with him, looking at the sky, which was illuminated by the setting sun in the west, the color of fire. After a long time, Wu Zhu suddenly asked coldly, "How old are you this year?" Fan Xian casually tied his long black hair behind his head, revealing a beautiful face that had finally begun to show its heroic spirit. He smiled and replied, 16. Chapter 34. Wu Zhu was a strange and mysterious man. In Fan Xian's eyes, Wu Zhu's life was bleak. He had lived for more than 30 years without a companion. Other than Fan Xian, there was no one he could talk to. Some of the residents of Danzhou Harbor still believed that Wu Zhu was not only blind, but also mute. His eyes were always covered by that black cloth. Fan Xian thought that there must be a terrible disability underneath, which was why he didn't want others to see it. Teacher Fei Jia called him Master Wu. It was obvious that Wu Zhu had been in the bureaucracy of the capital. But his way of doing things didn't have the air of an official. There wasn't even a hint of the mundane. He was like an immortal who didn't eat the food of mortals. Thinking of this, Fan Xian subconsciously looked at him. After Wu Zhu asked that question, he returned to silence. Coldly, he gazed at the dusk on the horizon. The faint red light enveloped his body and reflected on the black cloth covering his eyes, reflecting a color that leaped like fire. Fan Xian suddenly thought of a terrifying possibility. After thinking for a long time, he murmured, "Uncle, you were staring at those mountains in a daze. You didn't come down from the sky, did you?" He could accept things like Nigong now, and he even believed that the heavens had eyes. That was why he had been in this life. But if his companion of more than 10 years suddenly became an immortal above the clouds, he still wouldn't be able to accept it. The combination of transmigration and xianxia would only make him fall to the ground in fright. Wu Zhu shook his head. "I just seem to remember where I used to go with the lady." "Are you sure you're not an immortal, and my mother isn't an immortal? Are there immortals in this world? Isn't there a temple?" "Who said there were immortals living in a temple?" "Uncle, did you remember something?" "No, I just forgot something. Something unimportant." Wu Zhu stood up and nodded to the other side of the sea, as if saying goodbye. "Let's go back. There are some things I can tell you now." Fan Xian smiled. He knew that she had not forgotten her promise. Once he was 16, she would tell him some things about his mother. Walking to the edge of the cliff, he took a deep breath, and the Jinqi in his body began to slowly circulate. His whole body was attached to the cliff, and the Jinqi flowed along the meridians to the center of his palm. It was forced out of the surface of his palm by less than a hair's breadth, and then it quickly returned to his body from the edge of his palm. Right between his palm, it ingeniously formed a slightly sunken contact surface for the Jinqi. Because the Jinqi was invisible, it was guaranteed to form a perfect seal along the edge of his palm. His palm was firmly attached to the smooth rock, and with the suction force of the vacuum, his whole body was fixed in place. Then, he would release his Jinqi, and one of his hands would leave the rock. Just like that, Fan Xian climbed down the cliff with seemingly ease. Looks like Spider-Man. An ordinary martial arts cultivator would not be able to do this, no matter how abundant the qi in his body was. Fan Xian was able to do this because of his unique training method and body structure, as well as his unique way of thinking. In this world, all the strong martial artists only cared about the two words reality and power. The reality referred to the abundance of the Jinqi in the body, while the power was something that could only be understood, and was somewhat similar to the realm of cultivation. And magic, which focused on resonating with nature, had never caught the eye of the truly strong. In Wu Zhu's view, the so-called reality and power were actually the quantity and quality of the Jinqi, as well as the degree of precision in controlling it. After 10 years of teaching, Fan Xian was hovering between the 3rd and 7th level. In 4 years, he had not made any progress. The strong martial artists would subconsciously treat the Jinqi in their body as some kind of disposable tool or weapon. Like water, used to attack an opponent, once it was thrown out, there was no thought of taking it back. After a big battle, if the Jinqi was used up, it could be recovered by meditating. It was no wonder that everyone in the world thought this way. After all, once the Jinqi left the body, wanting to take it back was a fantasy. But Fan Xian was different. The Jinqi in his body had always been different from that of the average person. Pouring it from his back into the snowy mountain was like an opening, forming a large and small cycle with the yuan qi of the outside world, so he was much more sensitive to the Jinqi. At the same time, Fan Xian was very free, and at the same time very stingy. That was why he constantly tried to force the Jinqi out of his body and then take it back. After 3 years of hard work, he could now finally take the Jinqi back from the other side when it left the palm of his hand by 1/10 of an inch. At such a short distance, it was impossible to attack the enemy's body, so Fan Xian sadly admitted that his 3 years were basically useless. But since he had learned some useless tricks, he had to find some use for them. Every 3 days, he had to climb the sea cliff, and he felt that it was very tiring. His mind moved, and he used this trick of Jinqi to climb the mountain. Perhaps this was where Fan Xian was truly better than the people of this world. His thinking was not limited by the times, and he did not have any preconceived notions. Everything was new to him, and everything was possible. Fan Xian swam down the cliff like a fish. Looking up, Wu Zhu had already become a small black dot standing at the edge of the peak. He was not in a hurry, and looked up with a smile. He had always liked watching Wu Zhu descend the mountain. Wu Zhu took a step forward, as if there was flat ground in front of him. As soon as his feet were in the air, his figure began to float down. But every 30 feet or so, he would casually stretch out a palm and gently press on the stone of the cliff, slightly slowing the speed of his fall. After stretching out his palm a dozen times, he stood expressionlessly at the bottom of the cliff. Wu Zhu's method of descending the mountain seemed simple, but his experience of direction, angle, strength, speed, and even the sea breeze were all calculated perfectly in that moment. Such a powerful calculation and judgment ability was definitely that of one of the strongest in the world. If you thought that he was blind, then you could eliminate 1 or 2 of them. Although he had seen it countless times, Fan Xian could not help but applaud and praise. What a blind charm! Chapter 35. In March, the sea breeze in Danzhou was very gentle, and the scent of spring took over the entire stage. Unknown little yellow flowers bloomed all over the mountains, and every household used their petals to make tea. As they drank, they chatted with their neighbors outside their homes. So walking on the streets of Danzhou, one could always smell the faint fragrance of the flowers. It was not overpowering, but pure, and made one feel very peaceful. At night, it was when the spring rain often came. Following the light wind into the night, it silently moistened the land. It covered the black eaves of Danzhou and the stone pavement of the streets with a hazy layer of water. The light rain fell softly on the canvas outside the grocery store. It did not make much noise, but it washed away the thin layer of dust, making the store look a lot more lively. But the grocery store was not open that day. Fan Xian informed the Countess, and then sneaked into the store, peeling peanuts and drinking wine with Wu Zhu. The people in the Count's manor should have known that he liked to come to the grocery store, but they all thought that the young master was just greedy for the wine that the blind man brewed himself. On one hand, it was because Fan Xian really liked wine, and on the other hand, he needed a better excuse. Although he could not completely avoid the eyes of others when interacting with Wu Zhu, he still had to be careful. The kitchen knife rested on the chopping board. The cutting board was dry, and there were no scraps on the blade. It looked like it had not been used for a long time. The sound of cracking peanut shells rang out. Fan Xian tossed one into his mouth and slowly chewed it until the dried fruit was completely chewed into a fragrant paste. Only then did he pick up a small porcelain cup the size of 3 fingers in front of him, bring it to his lips, and drink it down with a slurp. Today, he was not drinking yellow wine, but tribute wine from the capital. The alcohol content was a little high, and Fan Xian felt like he was drinking Wuliangye. He was not in a hurry to ask questions, because he knew that Wu Zhu was a very simple person, and would not make him wait for long. Wu Zhu did not sit across from him. Instead, he held a bowl of yellow wine and sat in a dark corner of the room. His voice faintly rang out. The young lady's surname is Yi, and her name is Yi Qingmei. I'm her servant. Many years ago, Miss and I left home. Yi Qingmei. This was the first time Fan Xian had heard his mother's name. Inexplicably, his heart felt warm. He smiled and drank another cup of wine. Tactfully, he did not ask where his home was. If Wu Zhu was willing to tell him, he would certainly tell him. We lived in Dongyi for a few years. The young lady was born clever and understood everything. She also had a merciful heart. Thus, from the age of 15, she began to do business in Dongyi. Because she was too young, she could only hide behind the scenes and have the shopkeeper pretend to be the owner. Fan Xian's hand holding the wine cup paused in midair. He couldn't resist asking, what does doing business have to do with benevolence? He wasn't curious as to why his mother was born smart or why she was able to start a business and make money at the age of 15. After all these years, he had long guessed that his mother wasn't someone who could be judged by common sense. Wu Zhu replied in a cold voice, because the young lady pitied the suffering of the world, she liked to do good deeds. When Dongyi was flooded, the young lady was the one who opened most of the porridge shops. If you want to do good deeds, you must have money, so the young lady began to think of ways to make money. Fan Xian nodded, agreeing with this logic. Business was good. Gradually, people began to realize that the owner behind the shop was the young lady. Some of them began to plot against her, but I killed them all. Wu Zhu spoke calmly, but Fan Xian knew that the situation at the time must have been very tense. If Wu Zhu said business was good, then it must have been very good. As the saying goes, treasuring a jade ring becomes a crime. For a 15-year-old girl to have such a large family fortune, it could easily incite the ambitions of the world's unscrupulous people. But when he thought of the fact that there was a powerful bodyguard for his mother, Fan Xian's heart, which had been raised for no reason, calmed down. He suddenly thought of something and frowned. My mother's surname is Yi. Could it be that the business you opened back then belonged to the Yi family? Yes. The Yi family. Fan Xian's face was full of surprise. I've heard that name before. Legend has it that a dozen years ago, the Yi family was the #1 business in the world. I didn't know it was my mother's business. I didn't know how big the Yi family's business was, Wu Zhu said calmly. That wasn't part of my job scope. The young lady thought I had killed too many people, so she ended her business in Dongyi and came to the kingdom of Qing to live in the capital. Fan Xian didn't think things were that simple. After selling her business in Dongyi and coming to the kingdom of Qing, she had to have a good reason to do so. Wu Zhu continued. After the young lady came to the capital, she started her business again, and she did very well. Later on, she met a few people, including Count Sinan. Everyone seemed to listen to her, and according to her ideas, prepared to do some things and change some things. This created a conflict of interest with the nobles of the kingdom of Qing. Wu Zhu paused. One time, the kingdom of Qing was at war with the West, and the capital's defenses were weak. Coincidentally, something big happened. I wasn't in the capital, and the young lady could rely on had some problems. The young lady was killed by the nobles. When I rushed back to Taiping Courtyard, I only saved you, and then carried you to Danzhou. Fan Xian knew this very well, and he also knew that those enemies had been killed 10 years ago. The person who was in charge of revenge must have had something to do with his father and the Overwatch Council. The long silence made the sound of rain outside the grocery store particularly clear. That's it? Fan Xian asked, frowning. Could his mother's life be summed up in just a few words? What business did she do that could make all the nobles of the kingdom of Qing go after her? Why did the famous Overwatch Council teacher Fei Jia seem so respectful whenever his mother was mentioned? Basically, it's all over. Wu Zhu chose his words carefully. Fan Xian sighed, confirming that Wu Zhu really wasn't a good storyteller. A bitter smile appeared on his handsome face, knowing that he had to ask the questions himself. What business did my mother do? Luxury goods, military equipment, ships, food. Basically, anything that made money. Wu Zhu answered casually, but Fan Xian was startled by the name. His 2 lives' worth of experience made him understand that people who could do this kind of business usually had a powerful background. His mother was an orphan, and yet she had built her business from scratch to such a frightening degree. What happened to the business after my mother died? This was what Fan Xian was most interested in. After all, according to the laws of the kingdom of Qing, he should have been the sole heir to this enormous inheritance. Later, I heard that the Yi family's business was all taken over by the kingdom of Qing's treasury. Fan Xian shook his head with a bitter smile. So it had become the business of the royal family. He immediately abandoned the absurd idea of going to court to collect the family's inheritance. Instead, he smiled and said, the name Yi Qingmei must have been very eye-catching. I heard that when my mother entered the capital, she beat up the commander of the capital garrison. The oil lamp in the room flickered. Hearing Fan Xian's words, Wu Zhu seemed to remember something from the past. The corners of his mouth twitched in a strange way, revealing the trace of a gentle smile. Fan Xian's wrist froze, and the small porcelain cup fell to the square table, rolling around. In his heart, he shouted, he smiled. He actually smiled. Chapter 36. This was the first time the blind Wu Zhu had smiled. Or rather, this was the first time the 16-year-old Fan Xian had seen his uncle Wu Zhu smile. It was the moment he mentioned his mother. The blind Wu Zhu did not appear old when he was exposed under the black cloth, but he was always cold. He rarely showed any emotion, and it was even harder to see expressions like fear, sadness, or sorrow. He did not smile either. So when he thought of the past when he and the lady first arrived in Qing Kingdom, the corners of his lips curled up. It seemed a bit strange and awkward. But even so, it seemed that the person who never smiled occasionally showed gentleness. It was like a beautiful snow lotus suddenly blossoming in 1,000-year ice on a cliff. It was incomparably gentle and beautiful. With great difficulty, Fan Xian woke up from his daze. Wu Zhu had already returned to normal. He replied lightly, "Not many people know that the lady was called Yi Qingmei. The people around her just call her the lady. But the name Yi Qingmei, even now, I think, is very famous in Jingdou." "Is that so?" Fan Xian opened his eyes wide. He felt that Wu Zhu's words were somewhat contradictory. If not many people knew that his mother was called Yi Qingmei, then why was the name Yi Qingmei so famous? The reason he thought this was because he did not know of the glittering words and the signature on the stone tablet outside the Overwatch Council's door. "Tell me about my father." Fan Xian's eyes flashed. No one knew what he was thinking. "I only agreed to talk about the lady." You are very crafty, Wu Zhu. Before you were born, I had a serious illness and forgot many things." Fan Xian covered his mouth and laughed. "Uncle is even more shameless than me. Never mind, let's talk about something else." What did my mother look like?" Wu Zhu thought for a moment. "Very beautiful," he said. Although his voice did not contain too many complicated emotions, Fan Xian felt that when Wu Zhu said those 3 words, he seemed very sincere. He smiled slightly and rubbed his hands together. So she was a very beautiful girl. Although Wu Zhu's storytelling ability was very poor, Fan Xian could feel from between the simple lines how colorful the story of that woman in Jingdou must have been. He had a strong urge to go to the capital. He had to go to the capital. Wu Zhu gestured for Fan Xian to stand up and follow him. Fan Xian stood up curiously and walked to the back of the room. He watched as Wu Zhu gently pressed a few times on the stone wall. The wall suddenly made a soft sound, and then split in the middle, revealing a secret room inside. Surprised, Fan Xian followed Wu Zhu inside. There was nothing in the secret room. A thin layer of dust covered the floor and a box was placed in the corner. Because there was nothing else in the secret room other than the box, it was very conspicuous. It was a black leather suitcase, about the length of an adult's arm. It wasn't very wide, so it looked slender. No one knows. Before Mistress and I went to the capital, we stayed in Danzhou for a while. This chest was left behind by Mistress. I have kept it safe for you until now. In the future, you will keep it safe." Fan Xian's heart skipped a beat. He walked forward and brushed away the dust on the black suitcase. Looking at the opening, he saw that there was a brass lid that covered the opening. He was curious about what his mother had left for him. Unexpectedly, after a long time, he found that the lid wouldn't budge. There was no way to open the box. "There's no key," Wu Zhu reminded him, seeing how busy he was. Fan Xian hung his head dejectedly. "Why didn't you say so earlier? Then what's the point of giving me a chest that I can't open? Before I brought you to Danzhou, I needed to convince some people that you were dead, so I left the key there." Fan Xian thought that this was a bit too old-fashioned. He raised his eyebrows and took out the slender dagger that never left his side from the scabbard on his calf. He aimed it at the top of the suitcase, trying to see where it would be easier to open. "There's no need to try. This chest is much sturdier than you think." Fan Xian could tell that Wu Zhu was against him opening it by force. He smiled and stopped moving. He put away the dagger and patted the suitcase. He shook his head and sighed. "Maybe there's a few 100,000 taels of silver in there. What a pity." He then lifted the suitcase to test its weight. It was quite heavy, and his curiosity grew. "Where's the key?" "The capital." It was another very broad answer. Wu Zhu turned around and prepared to leave the secret room. Seeing that Wu Zhu wasn't paying attention to him, Fan Xian rolled his eyes. He bent his right elbow and fiercely struck the top of the suitcase with his palm. This strike contained all of his strength. It was overbearing, and it broke through the air. A muffled bang reverberated through the secret room. It kicked up a cloud of dust and obscured most of the light from the oil lamp. Wu Zhu's figure turned around coldly and looked at Fan Xian. Fan Xian was staring at his own palm, dumbfounded. There was no trace of the black suitcase other than some dust. It seemed that if he wanted to open this mysterious suitcase, he would have to go to the capital. Fan Xian thought to himself, planning when he would be able to leave Danzhou. His father in the capital wouldn't always let him retire by the seaside. He didn't know that the people Count Sinan had sent to pick him up were already on their way. In the spring of the 4th year of the Qing calendar, Ding Zijing sat in the only tavern in Danzhou harbor, wiping the sweat from his forehead and looking at one of the walls. A piece of paper was mounted on the wall with high-quality materials. The quality of the paper was pretty good, and it was densely packed with small characters. The handwriting was obviously the handwriting of the great calligrapher of the document pavilion, Pan Ling. The handwriting was elegant and spirited, upright and pure. In the capital, a piece of work of this size by Sir Pan Ling would fetch at least 300 taels of silver. Danzhou harbor was remote, so it was not surprising that it had been mounted on the wall like a god. But the content written on it was not suitable to be used to decorate a house, because it was filled with messy news. Yes, this was the legendary newspaper. There were only 2 copies of this newspaper in all of Danzhou harbor. The one belonging to the magistrate was naturally kept in the government office, while the one the tavern owner had obtained had been secretly purchased from a servant at the count's estate at a high price. Ordinary people would not be able to see this novelty, so they found it particularly magical. Since it was written by Sir Pan Ling, the tavern owner had hung it on the wall after purchasing it, treating it as the treasure of his tavern. What he didn't know was that this newspaper had been stolen and sold by young Master Fan of the estate. Young Master Fan had already sold more than 20 copies to wealthy merchants in the city, making a good profit. And Ding Zijing was about to meet young Master Fan. Chapter 37. The servants who had followed Ding Zijing to Danzhou were in the streets purchasing the local specialty flower tea. The count in the capital missed the tea of his hometown. In previous years, it had been the countess of the estate who had sent people to the capital to buy it. But since the count had sent people this time, they bought it as well. There were 3 carriages and 7 people from the count's estate, led by Ding Zijing. He did not wander the streets with the servants, instead wiping away his sweat. The weather in Danzhou was indeed hotter than in the capital. Originally, he should have gone to the count's estate to greet the countess as soon as he arrived in Danzhou, but when he thought of his mission, he felt a little guilty. So he sent his servants to buy the flower tea while he sat in the tavern to calm down. The second housekeeper who had been sent to Danzhou a few years ago had disappeared, and it was unknown whether he was dead or alive. Everyone in the count's estate knew that there was an irreconcilable conflict between the capital's branch and the Danzhou branch. Although Fan Xian was the only one in Danzhou, the truth made everyone wonder if something had happened to the second housekeeper. If that was the case, then the people of Fan Manor would have to re-examine the illegitimate son. After all, when the second housekeeper was killed, Fan Xian was only 12 years old. If he wanted to make the second housekeeper disappear without a trace, it could only have been on the orders of the countess. This proved that the countess was on Fan Xian's side, and the second wife's life was probably not going to be easy. Ding Zijing noticed that the newspaper on the wall was dated a month ago. He had read it in Count Sinan's study. There was nothing new in the newspaper. The important people in the capital were living peacefully. There was no update on the battle between the Great Prince and the Western Hu Kingdom, and the matter of the Prime Minister's illegitimate daughter seemed to have died down. At least under the protection of the Great Emperor, the young people of the Imperial Censorate had not achieved any further results. The newspaper was currently serializing the story of the first love of the director of the Overwatch Council. Although the newspaper was backed by the Emperor, the S would not have dared to do so if the extremely frightening and treacherous director was in the capital. It could be seen that Director Qin, who was highly regarded by the emperor, had not yet finished his first vacation in 20 years. Furthermore, His Majesty the Emperor would never make any big moves when the dean was not around. Thinking of the count's orders, Ting Zijing could not understand why they had to bring this young master of no status back to the capital before the director returned, and why the matter had been so urgent. He didn't dare to delay any longer. Even if he had to risk the wrath of the old lady, he had to take the young master away. Wiping his sweat, he stood up and ordered his men to drive the carriage to the count's manor in the corner of Danzhou Harbor. It was rare for the count's mansion to be so lively. All the servants and maids were standing at the bottom of the hall, curiously sizing up the people standing in the middle of the hall. Everyone knew that these people were from the capital. No wonder they looked so spirited even though they were wearing light green clothes. But the capital and Danzhou were far apart, and the two mansions did not have much interaction. It was rare to see so many servants from the capital, so the maids were all guessing that something was about to happen. Ting Zijing obediently led his subordinates to kneel on the ground and respectfully kowtowed to the old lady a few times to pay his respects. He then repeated Count Sinan's instructions before he left and quietly stood to one side, awaiting the old lady's verdict. Ting Zijing knew the old lady's true status in the Fan family, so he deliberately lowered his breathing to appear extremely respectful. But his eyes would occasionally sneak a glance at the young man who was standing behind the old lady, massaging her shoulders. The young man was very beautiful, with long eyelashes, thin red lips, and soft, bright eyes. He looked like a girl, but his face was full of smiles, which made him seem very amiable. This was, of course, Fan Xian. Ting Zijing sighed to himself. For such a beautiful man to be an illegitimate child with no status, God was indeed not fair. As if infected by the young man's sunny smile, Ting Zijing guessed that this young master was probably much easier to serve than the one back home in the capital. Hearing the servant's words, the old lady slightly lowered her eyes. She thought for a moment, then said in a low voice, "I understand. Zijing, go and rest. It's been a long and tiring journey. Cici, have Lao Huang prepare some hot water and food." The servants responded in unison, and the servants from the capital hurriedly thanked her and obediently left the hall. Although Ting Zijing was a little anxious, he did not dare to say anything in front of the old lady. He stole a glance at the young master, who still looked somewhat unfamiliar, and left. The hall suddenly became quiet. "You heard just now. Your father wants you to go to the capital." The old lady gently placed her hand on Fan Xian's shoulder and gently patted it twice. "What do you think?" Although Fan Xian's face was full of smiles, he had already made up his mind. He was also very confused as to why his father wanted him to go to the capital at this time, and without any warning. If it was to plan a way for him, an illegitimate child, to advance his status, the imperial examinations had already begun. If he went to the capital now, it would take at least a month. No matter what, he would not be able to make it in time. Hearing the old lady's question, he thought for a moment and smiled bitterly. "I've never been to the capital. Although I'm curious, I'm also a little afraid." This answer was half truth and half lie. The truth was that he was indeed very curious about the people of the capital, especially the place where his mother had once lived and fought. But he was not afraid at all, just a trace of confusion about the unknown. "Do you want to go?" The old lady smiled, as if she could see what the young man was thinking. "Yes," Fan Xian answered honestly. "I've lived in Danzhou since I was a child, and I've long wanted to go out." "Oh, you don't want to accompany an old thing like me anymore?" the old lady teased. Fan Xian laughed and joined in the fun. Yes. "Why don't you hit me, ancestor?" he continued. "In any case, the manager just said that father is preparing to move the entire manor back to the capital. I have nothing to worry about if I always go with you. The old woman shook her head calmly. Holding his hand, she had him stand in front of her. In a quiet voice, she said, "My body will not be able to withstand the waves of the wind. If you want to go, then go. It is better for me to stay in Danzhou and look after the house." Fan Xian was surprised. He had not expected his grandmother to be unwilling to return to the capital. For a moment, he did not know what to say. Chapter 38. In the quiet hall, the grandmother and grandson were momentarily speechless. In the courtyard, the floral tea bought by the people from the capital was piled in a corner. The fragrance of the tea slowly seeped out, overshadowing the fragrance of the flowers in the courtyard. Among the flowering trees, a few yellow butterflies fluttered up and down. Occasionally, the crisp cries of fledglings could be heard from the trees. Go. A young phoenix will have its first cry. You've grown up. You need to see the world. The countess continued with a smile, but if you go to the capital alone, as a child, I'm afraid you'll suffer a lot. Can you bear it? Fan Xian knew what his grandmother was talking about. He smiled sweetly. Second aunt has been very good to me these past few years. She often sends things over. Don't worry, grandmother. Madame Dowager shook her head with a smile. She knew that this little fellow, who looked calm on the outside but was actually mischievous, definitely did not have such thoughts in his heart. She patted his head and was silent for a while. Suddenly, she sighed and said, "If anything happens in the future, please bear with it for the sake of your father and me." Yes. Fan Xian smiled and nodded. Honestly speaking, I don't want to let you go to the capital, the countess said seriously. It's just that, you'll have to go to the capital eventually, so I have some things to tell you. Xian, listen to grandmother. Do you still remember housekeeper Zhou from 4 years ago? The countess looked at him with a smile. Fan Xian's heart skipped a beat. He didn't dare look his grandmother in the eye. After a while, he smiled bitterly and said, "Of course I remember." With this reply, the grandmother and grandson finally broke through the layer of paper. The countess said seriously, "You're a calm and intelligent child. There's nothing to worry about. But from what happened last time, I can see that you're still a bit too pure." Fan Xian sighed in his heart. Isn't pure a compliment? As if guessing what he was thinking, the countess narrowed her eyes and said coldly, "If you really want to go to the capital, you have to do one thing for me." What is it? Fan Xian vaguely guessed. Be ruthless. The countess seemed a bit tired. She leaned back against the armchair to rest. This world seems to be peaceful, but if you're not ruthless enough, you'll suffer in the end. Fan Xian was silent. In reality, he was not a nice guy. It was just that he had never had the opportunity to show his dark side in Danzhou. So, listening to the old woman's admonition, he knew that it was priceless advice. The old woman half closed her eyes and said, "Back then, your mother was very intelligent, but because she was too kind, she ended up." She suddenly opened her eyes and stared at Fan Xian. Enunciating each word, she said, "Would rather harm others than let others harm me." Fan Xian nodded his head vigorously. Go pack up. Your father is in a hurry. I'm afraid something really has happened in Jingdou. The countess looked tenderly at the child who had spent 15 years with her. I won't go to the capital. I'll stay in Danzhou. If you don't live well in the capital and someone wants to bully you, you can come back if you want. Okay, Fan Xian replied. He stood up and walked straight to his bedroom without saying anything else. After entering the room, he silently sat on the bed and pulled up the quilt to wipe his face, messing up his hair. He muttered to himself in a low voice, Damn, I almost cried. Grandma really knows how to stir up emotions. Just as night fell, the lights in the room dimly lit. Fan Xian's face was expressionless. He picked up his pen and wrote a letter to his sister in Jingdo, telling her of his upcoming arrival. After he finished writing, he realized that the post horse probably wouldn't be much faster than the Count's carriage. Perhaps by the time she received the letter, he would already be in Jingdo. It didn't seem necessary. But Fan Xian was a person who saved his energy. Since he had already written it, he casually sealed it in an envelope. He was about to tell Cici to remember to send the letter tomorrow, but when he turned his head, he saw his maidservant Cici propping up her chin thoughtfully and staring at him in a daze. Cici, what are you thinking about? He waved the envelope in front of the maidservant. Cici immediately woke up and said shyly, nothing. Is this a letter for the lady? Then give it to me. Fan Xian pulled his hand back and looked at her curiously. What's wrong? Cici thought for a moment and finally gathered the courage to ask, Young master, you're going to the capital. Are you very happy? Fan Xian sat up straight and looked at her with a smile. Why do you suddenly ask this? Young master, I've heard that the people in the capital are very bad. Cici bit her lower lip, not knowing whether or not to say it. And, after all, you don't have a high status. If you go to the capital government, you won't have a good time in front of the second wife. Fan Xian laughed. So you're worried about me? I'll just hide from her. Even if I don't have much of a future in the capital, I can still open a medical shop to support myself. It's fine as long as I don't stay in the Count's manor. I actually just want to go to the capital to have a look. Cici said, Young master, you won't be mediocre for the rest of your life. You've read so many books. Next year, you'll take the imperial examinations. In the future, you'll be a high-ranking official and bring honor to your ancestors. Seeing how serious she was, Fan Xian smiled and didn't respond. He didn't have any thoughts about bringing honor to his ancestors. Deep in his heart, he didn't have any feelings for his cheap father in the capital. This was too different from his relationship with his grandmother. Young master, why don't you want to take me to the capital? This was what Cici was truly worried about. She looked at Fan Xian pitifully. The servant girls in the capital must all listen to the second wife. You don't have anyone you can rely on. What are you going to do? Fan Xian sighed. Cici was older than him by 2 years. If she'd been in someone else's home, she would probably have been allowed to go out a long time ago. It was only because he had lived 2 lives that he secretly appeared much more mature and steady, which made Cici feel that he was very reliable. He looked at Cici and said seriously, It's because I don't know what the capital is like that I can't take you with me. Cici actually understood this, but she thought about how she and the young master would be far apart and would probably never see each other again. Her heart ached a little, and she quickly turned her face away and tidied up the things on the desk. Fan Xian watched her busy figure and his heart was also gloomy, but he knew he couldn't say anything. Perhaps the capital had good scenery and many interesting people and things, but it was also bound to have knives and spears in the light and arrows in the dark. He was willing to take some small risks to experience these things. Since he had a second life, there was no reason for him to spend the rest of his life alone in the tiny city of Danzhou. But he wasn't sure he could protect the people around him, so Cici couldn't go with him. At night, he quietly went to the grocery store. Chapter 39. Ting Zijing had never imagined that the mission the Count had given him would be completed so smoothly. He had thought that since Fan Xian did not have a respectable status, he would be very resistant to going to the capital and provoking the second wife. He would do everything he could to delay his stay in Danzhou. He did not expect that the young master would agree to the Count's request without a care in the world. He had known early in the morning that the Countess had decided to stay in Danzhou, but he didn't care. As long as the nameless Fan Xian followed them back to the capital, it would be fine. As for the Countess, since she liked the seaside, she would retire here. The Count had not requested that the entire manor move back to the capital. The 3 black carriages were parked in front of the manor. The driver's seats were covered with blue cloth cushions. The combination of blue and black made for a beautiful sight. The entrance was already surrounded by the residents of Danzhou City. Seeing the scale of the move, they had already gathered around. After asking around, they found out that Fan Xian was returning to the capital today. Although the residents of Danzhou Harbor had all the shortcomings of humans, such as jealousy and sharp-tongued, over the past decade, they had often seen Fan Xian strolling through the streets and shouting from the rooftops. They had always developed some feelings for him. Now that they heard that he was leaving for a prosperous place like the capital, they knew that he would most likely never return. Naturally, they felt a little sad. A large group of people gathered at the entrance of the Count's manor, waiting for Fan Xian to step out for the last time. But after waiting for a long time, that beautiful and perpetually smiling face was still nowhere to be seen. The backyard was a mess. Fan Xian smiled as he leaned against a pillar, watching a few servant girls bustle about. One girl shouted, "Toothbrush, I forgot to bring my toothbrush." This caused the servant girls to search for it for a long time. After coming to this world, Fan Xian had not made any great inventions. He had only made his toothbrush a little more comfortable. He had changed the ponytail toothbrush favored by the people of the time into pig hair. He had also softened the pillow, replacing the hard pillow with cotton. He had also made a shower nozzle and hung it at the back of the bedroom. There were many more, but it seemed that only a small portion of them could be brought to the capital. After an indeterminate amount of time, when the last carriage was completely stuffed with several large bags, Fan Xian finally walked out of the manor slowly with a smile on his face, supporting the old woman. After raising his hands to the surrounding villagers, Fan Xian was not surprised to see Cici in the crowd with slightly red eyes. Presumably, she had cried last night. Fan Xian made an exception today and wore a long robe. He lifted the front of his robe, knelt on the ground, and kowtowed to the old lady. After he stood up, he hugged the old granny tightly in a way that was completely out of line with the current world's etiquette. He kissed his granny's wrinkled forehead forcefully before saying softly, "Granny, think of a way to find a good husband for Cici. At least one like Dong He." All the servants in the manor pretended not to see the young master's mischievous appearance. The old mistress was also shocked. She never thought that her usually calm and sensible grandson would have such a mischievous side to him. She knocked him on the forehead and scolded, "What are you doing? I will naturally take care of these matters." His gaze swept over the familiar faces in front of him. Fan Xian smiled slightly and raised his hands in salute to everyone. All these years, everyone has worked hard. The servants did not dare to accept the salute and quickly moved out of the way. The old mistress suddenly smiled and said, "Let's go. Don't let your father worry in the capital. As for Cici, in the future, if you have a comfortable life in the capital, I will let her come to you." Fan Xian was startled. Before he could say anything, he was already muddle-headed in the carriage. As the wheels rolled, the carriage slowly moved out of the city of Danzhou. The sky was bright and beautiful. Above the blue sky, the clouds were like silk. It was exceptionally beautiful. The carriage passed by a grocery store and passed by a tofu stall in the distance. Fan Xian lifted the curtain of the carriage and looked at the young woman in the tofu stall and the little girl beside her, who could already run around freely. A smile rose to the corners of his lips, and he sat back in his seat. Under the seat was an old black leather suitcase. The grocery store with the worst business in Danzhou had finally closed down. The residents of the city casually said a few words, guessing that the blind owner would one day be lonely and destitute. After a few words of sympathy, they began to change the topic to young Master Fan, who had just left the small city. The people all guessed that the Count had allowed his illegitimate son to enter the capital, and what kind of position he had arranged for him. At that moment, Fan Xian was lying in the spacious carriage. This carriage was in the middle of the procession, and it was covered with bedding that he had prepared himself. It was very soft, and he did not feel too much of a jolt. Naturally, he had also guessed the real reason his father had allowed him to enter the capital, so he invited the leader of the group of guards, Ting Zijing, in for a chat. Ting Zijing sat on the other side of the carriage with a sullen face. He did not know where to put his feet, afraid that he would dirty the snow-white bedding next to his feet. He felt very uncomfortable in his heart. It seemed that this young master was also a wastrel, not much better than the young masters of the capital. Fan Xian comfortably stretched his back and narrowed his eyes. Looking at the middle-aged man, who clearly had extraordinary strength, he asked, "Ting De, we are already very far from Danzhou. Can you tell me why father wants me to enter the capital this time?" Ting Zijing was a little hesitant, as if there were some things that he could not say. Fan Xian smiled, his eyes incomparably clear. He looked into Ting Zijing's eyes and said softly, "You know my background, so it is inevitable that you will be a little worried." Ting Zijing squeezed out a smile, and replied respectfully, "Young master, you think too much. Master has brought you to the capital this time, so naturally, it is to prepare for your future." Fan Xian waved his hand and shook his head. "There are only the two of us in the carriage. There is no need to hide anything." He suddenly laughed. "If you are not willing to tell me, who knows, I might jump out of the carriage and run away." Ting Zijing laughed. "Young master, you like to joke." Before he could finish, Fan Xian had already cut him off coldly. "Sometimes I do not like to joke." Ting Zijing's heart thumped. Could it be that Fan Xian was being serious? If you really do not want to go to the capital, that is something that everyone can guess. Then why did you not object to it in front of the Countess in Danzhou? Looking at the gentle and beautiful young man in front of him, Ting Zijing increasingly felt that there was more to him than met the eye. Fan Xian naturally would not run away. Although he knew that going to the capital would not bring him much good, these years of being a wealthy and leisurely man had long since lost the courage to roam the Jianghu. To live in a desolate mountain and suffer in a broken temple was not in line with his personality. He had come to this world to enjoy life. And he was very willing to go to the capital to take a look, so when Count Sinan sent someone to pick him up, he did not even think about objecting. But this did not mean that he was not curious about what was hidden behind this matter. After a long silence, Ting Zijing finally could not stand the icy silence in the carriage. "Young master," he said, "the reason why we were in such a hurry to bring you back to the capital is that master has arranged a marriage for you." Fan Xian looked at him for a long time before saying, "A marriage?" Chapter 40. "Yes," Ting Zijing replied respectfully. Ting Zijing replied respectfully. He did not want to repeat the tragic fate of the second housekeeper from a few years ago, so he was especially respectful to this half-master in front of him. Fan Xian frowned, and a calmness that did not match his age appeared on his face. He did not have the expression that most youths would have when they heard that they were about to get married. "I am very curious," he said slowly. He was 16 years old, and had long known that in such a powerful family, marriage would certainly be a matter of importance. Since his father had not forgotten him all these years, this day would eventually come. But this time, the timing was so urgent that he did not understand why this marriage was so urgent. Ting Zijing replied, "Well, I am not sure. I only heard that the young lady is virtuous and has always been well known in the capital." His careful explanation only made Fan Xian more suspicious. He was an illegitimate child with no status. Even if his parents had an unusually deep background, no official family would be willing to marry their daughter to him. Seeing his expression, Ting Zijing finally said, "But the young lady does not seem to be in good health. She has been ill recently, so it is urgent." Fan Xian suddenly understood. So he was a magical object of joy. He could not help but smile bitterly and shake his head. Ting Zijing carefully observed his expression and found that the young master was neither angry nor sorrowful. Instead, he seemed to be in a daze. He was about to marry a young madam who was about to die. How could the young master not be angry at all? Fan Xian did not have anything to be angry about. In his previous life, he had seen too many scenes like this, and anger would not help solve the problem. In his heart, he felt some sympathy for the bedridden young lady in the capital. Because of her poor health, she was forced to marry a man she had never met. As for himself, Fan Xian did not have the gloominess of a petty man. He had always been a bit of a male chauvinist. He believed that when it came to matters between men and women, the woman was always at a disadvantage and the man was always at an advantage. Since he was going to marry and have children in this world, what if he picked up a good woman? In any case, he had to get to the capital first. Running away from a marriage could not be rushed. He would wait and see. Everything had to wait and see. Was the girl pretty? Cute? Lolita? Young master, why? Ting Zijing asked carefully. Why not? Fan Xian looked at him with a slight smile and quietly said, "First of all, just because I'm going to Jingdo doesn't mean I'll accept this marriage. Secondly, if I accept this marriage, it must mean that I like that woman. Thirdly, even if that woman was bedridden, I wouldn't feel that it was humiliating. Fourth, you might not know this, but I'm actually a very good doctor." Ting Zijing was stunned. These 4 reasons confused him, especially the last one. The young master actually knew medicine. However, he still didn't think that the young master's marriage would turn from a tragedy to a comedy because of this. After all, the young lady's family wasn't simple. Even the imperial physicians couldn't cure her, so how could the young master cure her? The carriages never stopped. Ting Zijing went out and boarded the first carriage, leaving Fan Xian alone in the carriage. It was inevitable that the journey would be lonely. He lifted the curtain of the carriage and allowed the strong wind to blow on his face. He squinted his eyes and looked at the green mountains and the stone road on the official road that whizzed past. He felt as if countless scenes were rewinding. It was just like what he saw on the carriage 16 years ago when he first arrived in this world. One day at the end of the 4th month, the long grass by the road outside Jingdo had long since been removed, and the warblers had been scared away by the men and women who came and went for a walk. Only the 2 rows of green willow trees along the moat swayed gracefully, proudly examining the people who had come from all over the world outside the city. A small group of 3 carriages came from afar and lined up on the official road, waiting to enter the city. The curtain of the carriage was lifted, revealing a clean face full of sunshine. The man looked at the walls of the capital and the peaceful people around him. He took a deep breath and said, "So this is the smell of Jingdo." This man was, of course, Fan Xian. After dozens of days of arduous travel, they had finally arrived in Jingdo. Along the way, he looked curiously at the unfamiliar world of the kingdom of Qing. He had finally satisfied his desire to travel, and he had become much more familiar with Ting Zijing and the other guards. Fan Xian was a cute young man who was used to wearing a smile on his face. This kind of person always made people feel good about him. Ting Zijing took his hand and helped him down from the carriage. When his feet landed on the official road, Fan Xian turned his ankles slightly, deliberately letting the soles of his cloth shoes touch the ground a little longer. It seemed that he wanted to experience the uniqueness of the land in Jingdo. There were a lot of people entering the capital, and security was tight, so the queue was a little long. Fan Xian was a little bored waiting. He pointed at the city wall in front of him and chatted with Ting Zijing. He guessed that Count Sinan's manor would not send anyone to pick him up. After all, his identity was not very honorable. As they chatted, there was suddenly a slight commotion in the crowd behind them. The crowd consciously parted to make a wide path for them. A group of cavalrymen silently rode over. Their speed was very fast, and they headed towards the city gate without stopping at all. On the horse at the very front of the group was a young girl wearing a light-colored dress. In the spring weather, she wore a white deerskin hat, which made her look very playful. The young girl's eyebrows were as dark as the distant mountains, and her eyes were clear and bright. She was very beautiful. But as she sat on the horse, her expression was slightly anxious. It seemed that she was in a hurry to return to the city. Something must have happened. Fan Xian stood by the side of the road, smiling as he watched the group of riders pass by. "There are many beauties in the capital," he exclaimed in admiration. He couldn't help but think of his possible wife, who he did not know what she looked like. Ting Zijing coughed lightly beside him. Fan Xian thought that he had only praised her, and that he had not lost his composure. Why was he so nervous? He smiled and asked, "It seems that the atmosphere in the capital is not as closed as I thought. This girl is wearing a dress, but she is still riding a horse, and no one is talking about it." Ting Zijing explained with a wry smile, "The one who just passed by is the only daughter of the commander of the capital garrison, Yi Zhong. Who would dare say that she went?" Fan Xian grunted in acknowledgement and stood on the carriage to look toward the city gate. As expected, the group of riders arrived at the city gate. They did not line up, but simply checked their tokens and entered the city. When it was Fan Xian's turn to enter the city, he deliberately looked at the expressions of the soldiers at the city gate. He found that they had a businesslike expression, and then looked back at his own carriage. Only then did he understand what was going on. The three carriages did not have the insignia of the Fan family. It seemed that he had not entered the capital with great fanfare. Chapter 41. Fan Manor was located in the eastern part of the capital, some distance away from Tianhe Road and out of sight of the palace. The people who lived there were all officials and nobles, and there was no room for the common people, so it was relatively quiet. On a deserted street, there was a mansion gate every 30 meters or so. Outside each mansion gate, there was a pair of stone lions squatting quietly. Dozens of stone lions were bored to death in front of their own gates, staring at the carriages that passed by on the street. The black carriage slowly passed through the street. There were no curious gazes on either side of the road. When it reached the side of Fan Manor, the carriage turned into a side alley with some difficulty. Under the shade of a tree, it stopped at a corner door. Fan Xian lifted the curtain and helped Ting Zijing out of the carriage. His face was expressionless. He looked around and nodded inconspicuously. The wooden door opened with a creak, and the servants inside came out to greet them. They looked at Fan Xian curiously and stammered as if they didn't know how to greet him or how to greet him. Fan Xian smiled and said nothing. He followed Ting Zijing through the door. The servants let out a sigh of relief and began to move the carriage, which was stuffed full of luggage. A servant had been waiting at the door for a long time, and he led the two of them in. As they went further in, they saw that the courtyard gradually grew deeper. There were fake mountains, flat grass, and shallow water. The scenery was quite elegant. Along the way, they met some old women. When they saw that someone had come, they quietly stood guard by the side of the road. There was no chaos at all. As they went deeper and deeper, they still had not reached the inner courtyard. Fan Xian couldn't help but admire the grandeur of the old manor in the capital. It was dozens of times larger than the manor in Danzhou. To be able to have such a large manor in the capital, where every inch of land was worth its weight in gold, it seemed that his father's power was not ordinary. If it had been an ordinary person, they would have been a little nervous and reserved upon entering a luxurious mansion. Even Sister Lin in Dream of the Red Chamber, when she first entered Ronghua Manor, did not dare to say too much, afraid that she would make a mistake and lose face for herself and the manor. But Fan Xian was not an ordinary person. Having lived 2 lives, he had experienced life and death, which made him feel somewhat free and at ease. Moreover, he had long gotten used to his identity as an illegitimate child. Based on his mentality from his previous life, he did not feel that this identity was shameful. Instead, he felt that his father should be the one to lose face. From this point on, he did not care about the Fan Manor's reputation. Therefore, as he walked, he looked around with a smile on his face, without a trace of restraint. Although there was still some shyness in his smile, this shyness was just a cover. He looked at the scenery in the mansion and clicked his tongue in wonder. When he passed by the weeping willow, he stroked it. When he crossed the arch bridge over the shallow lake, he looked at the golden fish in the water. All the servants in the manor saw his demeanor as he walked, and they could not help but be curious. This young master, whom they had heard of for more than 10 years, was actually such a person. They could not tell what was good or bad about him, but they felt that there was something special about this young man. They just did not know how to put it into words. When they reached the inner courtyard, Ting Zijing reminded him in a low voice, "Young master, I can't go in here. You should go in yourself." After some thought, he could not help but remind him, "Young master, please speak." Along the way, Ting Zijing had begun to admire Fan Xian's indifference. Thinking of the secret struggles in the Fan Manor, he could not help but want to remind him of something. But as soon as the words left his mouth, he realized that he was being too impulsive, and did not know how to phrase them. Fan Xian knew what he was thinking and was slightly moved. He smiled and saluted him. "Don't worry, Ting Zijing." He then reminded him to remember to pack his luggage, as he might need it at night, and so on. At a time like this, Ting Zijing knew that the handsome young man in front of him was far more mature than his peers. Hearing this, he felt a bit more at ease. He smiled and went with the servant to the side courtyard to rest. The servant leading the way had been replaced by a servant girl, and she was a young and pretty girl. Fan Xian followed the girl into the back courtyard. A middle-aged woman came over with a brass basin. She half knelt and bowed, then helped him wash his face. The temperature of the water was neither too hot nor too cold, just right. Fan Xian was silent. He wiped his hands, handed the towel back, and said thank you. The middle-aged woman was a bit surprised to hear this, and retreated in a panic. Fan Xian smiled. Only now did he remember that the capital was not Danzhou. His politeness to the servant girls seemed unnecessary and inappropriate here. Even after entering the inner courtyard, he did not stand in the middle of the hall, but was led to the side door by the servant girls. The wall of the side door was painted completely white, but above the door was a slightly protruding black eave. He stood there for a long time, but no one paid any attention to him. He didn't know if the old house was trying to intimidate him as an illegitimate son, but he gradually felt a bit impatient. He took a deep breath and suppressed it. He raised his eyes to look at the black eave, and upon closer inspection, he found that it was an ancient building. It was indeed elegant. In fact, Fan Xian had wronged them. The servant girls stood to the side, not because they wanted to give him the cold shoulder, but because they knew the identity of the young man. For a moment, they did not dare to approach him. They did not know how to address him, as he was not the son of the legitimate wife of Fan Manor. For another, the servants did not dare to act rashly before the master of the house arrived. But by now, someone had already gone to inform the master. Fan Xian waited for a while and laughed at himself. He waved his hand and called over the servant girl who had led him. The servant girl was delicate and pretty, her face smooth and tender. She was still very young. In a small voice, she asked, Young. What are your orders? She had wanted to call him young master, but when she thought of the problem, she could not. Instead, she swallowed the word young master, and her face turned red. Fan Xian looked at the little girl and laughed. Bring me a chair. The servant girl did as she was told, and brought a wooden chair from the hall. The chair was a little heavy, and she was slightly out of breath. Fan Xian went forward to take the chair and put it on the ground. He smiled and sat down on it. He raised his head to look at the eve, no longer caring about the gazes around him. The servant girls and old women were shocked to see the young man sitting on the chair. The elders had not arrived, so the juniors should be cautious. How could he be so arrogant? The sound of footsteps came from the corridor, and a faint fragrance was carried by the wind, invigorating one's spirit. Fan Xian turned his head and saw a noblewoman walking over with a smile on her face. The woman's face was beautiful, and her eyes were like lacquer. Her dress swayed slightly, and the gold ornaments were a little messy. But when paired with the woman's hidden nobility, it did not seem ostentatious. On the contrary, it seemed reasonable. Fan Xian took a deep breath and stood up from the chair. The woman's eyebrows were like black ink, and when she smiled, the whole hall was bright. She looked at Fan Xian from afar and said, Xianer, you must have had a hard journey. Please sit. Fan Xian smiled sweetly. Hello, Auntie. Chapter 42. It was the second wife of Count Sinan. Her name was Lu Ruyu, and she had been taken in by Count Sinan more than 10 years ago. Her family background was deep, and within 3 generations they had produced a duke. So when she married Count Sinan, it caused a lot of discussion in the capital. Everyone was curious as to what the Lu family was thinking by betrothing their daughter to Fan Jian. Although Fan Jian had already inherited the title of Count Sinan, he was still a distant relative of the great Fan clan. It was only in the last 10 years that Count Sinan had become more and more popular, and his official rank had gradually risen. Only then did the Lu family and this woman's vicious vision come to an understanding. But strangely, Count Sinan had never made her official. Whether it was from the perspective of reason or from the position of Lady Lu's maiden family, there was absolutely no reason for it. Fan Xian smiled cutely and bowed deeply to the second wife. Xian pays his respects to Aunt. Lady Lu's face was also full of smiles, but an indescribable look flashed through her eyes. She could tell that the brat in front of her had tightly grasped the 2 words Yinyang, and did not address her as second madam like other people. The difference between a wife and an aunt was like the difference between the clouds and the soil. Lady Lu smiled. Come in. Why are you sitting under the eaves in a daze from so far away? If outsiders see you, they will say that Fan Manor is a place that cannot tolerate people. Cannot tolerate people. Naturally, there was something intolerable about them. Fan Xian sighed to himself. He knew that Aunt Lu was reminding him of his status as an illegitimate child, and he admired the way she spoke. Originally, he had not intended to provoke her with words. He knew that she had operated in the capital for a long time, and there was no point in taking advantage of her verbally. But then he thought, since there was an irreconcilable conflict between the 2 sides, why should he tolerate her? He thought that this concubine was different from what he had imagined in the past. She should not be a sinister idiot like he had imagined. So, at this moment, he did not understand why this woman in front of him 4 years ago would resort to such a stupid method of killing people with poison. He followed the second wife into the hall, not too far away from her. Fan Xian smelled the unique fragrance of a noblewoman. He sniffed it and thought it smelled good. To be able to think of such trivial things at a time like this, Fan Xian was somewhat satisfied with his current state of mind. He smiled and chatted with Lady Lu. The noblewoman and the young man really did play the role of a loving mother and a filial son. The tea was served. It was the authentic Five Peaks flower tea. Good tea. Desserts were also served. They were authentic Jiangnan flaky pastries, delicious. After talking about what they had seen and heard along the way, greeting the old woman in faraway Danzhou, talking about the scenery by the seaside in Danzhou, and what was different about Jingdou, everyone found that there was nothing more to say. Thus, Lady Lu and Fan Xian tacitly shut their mouths and sank into silence. Both sides realized that neither of them were easy to deal with. There was no point in trying to sound each other out with words. Since that was the case, they might as well keep silent. Therefore, the atmosphere in the living room was a little awkward. The maids who served them were as quiet as cicadas in winter, and even their footsteps when changing the tea were much lighter. Only Fan Xian and the second wife were not embarrassed. Occasionally, they would hold their teacups and look at each other with gentle gazes. Lady Lu's heart was slightly heavy. She realized that the young man in front of her was indeed not ordinary. He was able to deal with this situation with ease, without the slightest nervousness or restraint. He was mature and steady, even more so than the old man. It seemed that 4 years ago, she really shouldn't have listened to that person's instigation. For no reason at all, this young man had taken the initiative to see her as an enemy. Now it was not easy to deal with, and there were many tricks that she couldn't use. In this silence, Lady Lu suddenly felt that this was weakening her influence. After all, she was the elder in name, so she lightly coughed. Your father is now the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Revenue. This time, when you return to the capital, will you prepare for next year's imperial examinations, or will you directly work for the Ministry of Revenue? Fan Xian smiled. I will listen to you, father. He paused. But I don't know when you will return. To tell the truth, there were a few people in the capital that he wanted to see. This noblewoman in front of him was naturally one of them, as well as teacher Fei Jia and Ruoruo. But the one he was most curious about was his father. He was very curious about how Count Sinan had attracted the attention of his mother, the head of the Yi family, who was the wealthiest in the world. In the depths of his mind, he only recognized the dead woman as his mother, and did not want to recognize Count Sinan as his father. This was probably a strange way of thinking in a man's heart. Your father will be back in a moment. As they spoke, there was a slight commotion at the gate of the inner courtyard. The maids were rushing to greet someone, but the noise came too quickly. The maids couldn't stop them, and a young girl walked in. This young girl was not particularly beautiful, but her brows were unusually clean. There was a natural softness to her, but there was also a hint of coldness. This coldness was not what most people would call an icy beauty, or a contempt for the filthy things around her. Rather, it was a kind of indifference born from some unknown confidence, a feeling of resistance to her surroundings. Fan Xian's heart trembled. This kind of coldness on the face of a young girl from a noble family was very unfitting. The young girl looked straight at Fan Xian's face, and the coldness between her brows gradually faded, until it disappeared without a trace. Instead, her cheeks flushed with excitement. She opened her mouth to speak, but stopped herself. She took half a step back, and with a very slight movement tidied up her clothes. She curtsied, and with a clear and gentle voice, she said, "Greetings, brother." Fan Xian smiled and reached out to help her up. Sister Ruoro, no need to be so courteous. Their gazes met. They were both so clear, without a trace of impurity. There was only a faint smile. After years of correspondence, it could be assumed that this pair of brother and sister were the ones who knew each other the best in the world. However, a rather insensible child's voice rang out, instantly shattering the beautiful feeling of reunion between the siblings after 10 years. Hey, you're Fan Xian. Fan Xian turned his head to look at the young man who had stepped through the high threshold. The young man was a little chubby, and there were a few annoying black moles on the left side of his face. His face was full of resentment, and he looked at Fan Xian with slight disgust. Chapter 43. Fan Xian sat down, ignoring the boy and letting his sister sit first. He smiled and asked, "Who are you?" Of course he could guess who this chubby boy was, but he deliberately did not point it out. "I am Fan Xija, the young master of the Fan family." The chubby boy looked at him and snorted. "So you are the illegitimate son." Fan Xian heard a faint sound in his ear. Out of the corner of his eye, he looked at Lady Lu. Unexpectedly, Lady Lu had already run away for no reason. He didn't know where she had gone. It seemed that she had deliberately let her own son cause a ruckus and break Fan Xian's composure. In any case, if anything untoward happened, he could use the excuse that Xija was young and insensible. A strange smile appeared on Fan Xian's lips. He had known in Danzhou that this young master of the capital government had a bad temper and had always been rude and unreasonable. For the sake of his father, Fan Xian decided to take the time to teach this little brother a lesson in order to prevent the Fan family from offending the real nobles in the future because of this kid. But what happened next was completely out of his expectations. A cold voice rang out. It came from Fan Ruoro's thin lips. "Give me your hand." Having said that, Miss Fan took out a long ruler from under the table. "Why?" Fan Xija mumbled. His face was full of fear, but he obediently extended his hand. With 2 smacks, 2 red marks appeared on Fan Xija's hand. Tears began to well up in his eyes, but he gritted his teeth and endured it. "Sister, for an outsider." Before he could finish the word outsider, Fan Ruoro expressionlessly struck the chubby boy's hand twice with the ruler. Fan Xian now realized that his sister's cold demeanor was very oppressive in the eyes of an ordinary person. "First, you cannot call my brother by his name. Secondly, you have to understand our family's identity. Don't say such nonsense. Third, you must be punished for being disrespectful to your brother." Fan Ruoro spoke lightly. The way she held the ruler reminded Fan Xian of those kindergarten aunties who looked weak and cute, but were actually very fierce. Fan Xija glared at Fan Xian, flattened his lips, and ran to the backyard. "Every time he cries, he goes to find his mother." Fan Ruoro sighed. "I'm very curious. What is the meaning of Xija? His thoughts are as sluggish as a pig's, and his tyrannical actions leave trails behind." Such an elegant name, yet it was interpreted by my younger sister into these 2 sentences. What a joke. It's not as funny as Big Brother's joke. Why can you beat people with a ruler? Father gave me the right to discipline him. This seems to be a little different from my analysis of this world. Are you talking about men's rights? Yes, there is also the issue of the distribution of power in the backyard of the family. At present, I seem to have gained a little power. But don't forget, your power is completely dependent on that man's likes and dislikes. Brother, don't forget that the man you're talking about is our father. Fan Xian and Fan Ruoro looked at each other and smiled. They were very happy. There were no outsiders present, and Fan Ruoro was no longer as restrained as before. She smiled, and it was obvious that she could not suppress the happiness in her heart. Fan Xian was the same. In this world, probably only his sister, who they often exchanged letters with, could truly use a certain logic that only he could use to converse with her. Furthermore, when they first exchanged letters, Fan Ruoruo was still young. To a certain extent, Fan Xian's view of this world and life had been greatly influenced by Fan Xian's imperceptible influence. The two of them hadn't seen each other for 10 years, so they should have been somewhat unfamiliar. However, the conversation just now, which only the two of them could feel, quickly pulled the distance between them closer in their hearts. It was as if the brother or sister sitting in front of them had not been separated for 10 years. Instead, they were good friends who spent every day in the courtyard and studied side by side. In this kind of relationship, Fan Ruoruo saw Fan Xian as a teacher-like figure, while Fan Xian saw his sister as a student or junior. This kind of mentality was very subtle. Fan Xian looked at her with a slight smile and said in a low voice, "Seeing that you seem to be doing well in the manor, I've been worrying a bit too much." Fan Ruoruo lowered her head and quietly said, "It's all thanks to you for your ideas." Oh. Fan Xian smiled shyly. Could it be that the romantic scenes from his previous life that he had written had an effect? But this was not something he could ask directly. "Recently, Lady Lu has been more peaceful," Fan Ruoruo said lightly. She called her aunt Lady Lu. Even though there were only the two of them in the hall, it still seemed very cold. Fan Xian thought for a moment and then said, "Although I'm far away in Danzhou, I know that the Lu family has a very high status in the capital. Don't be too disrespectful to her." "I won't." Fan Ruoruo lowered her eyelids, her eyelashes resting on her white skin. It was very beautiful. Fan Xian looked at her with a smile. He realized that to find someone in a world who could understand oneself was indeed a very happy thing, even though this person had been taught by him. He softly said, "Did you receive my letter?" "Yes." Fan Ruoruo smiled. The frost on her face had long since disappeared. "2 nights ago, I saw that letter in my room. It scared me. I thought it was some bad guy, but when I saw the handwriting on the letter, I realized it was you." Fan Xian shrugged. Given Wu Zhu's abilities, being a messenger was a bit of a waste of his talent. No one entered the hall to interrupt their conversation, which Fan Xian was very satisfied with. He took a sip of tea and said seriously, "You probably don't know why I came to the capital this time." Fan Ruoruo raised her head and looked at her brother with a faint smile. Fan Xian was a little embarrassed by her gaze. "What's wrong?" A teasing sigh sounded out. The girl smiled and said, "Many people probably know why you came to the capital. And I believe that the children of the famous families in the capital are all very curious. Count Sinan's illegitimate son has come to the capital this time, and how much confidence he has in that matter." Ah. Fan Xian was a little surprised. "I always thought that father's decision to let me come to the capital was a secret. Do many people know about it? But I believe that not many people in the capital know who I am. Why would anyone be curious about me?" "Because you came to the capital to get married." Fan Ruoruo smiled. "The woman father wants you to marry is very famous." Fan Xian frowned. Although he didn't necessarily want to marry her, he was still very concerned about what kind of person he might marry. "Do you know the young lady?" "My future sister-in-law is the young lady of the Lin family." Fan Ruoruo's eyes flashed with an unreadable light. "I'm not the only one who knows her. I believe that everyone in the capital knows her." "Which Lin family? Why is that woman so famous?" Fan Xian raised his eyebrows. "Brother, although you've always been far away in Danzhou, I know that Granny should have a copy of the paper printed in the palace." Fan Ruoruo laughed. Fan Xian thought for a moment, then slapped his forehead. Could it be that the Lin family is the family of Prime Minister Lin Ruofu? That young lady is the main character in the matter of the Prime Minister's illegitimate daughter. Chapter 44. Presently, the Qin kingdom was known as the Golden Age of Prosperity. The weather had been favorable for a decade, and the people were wealthy and at ease. They had the titles of the wisest ruler in 1,000 years, the best ruler in 1,000 years, and the best ruler in 1,000 years. But, miraculously, what followed was what was known as the most corrupt officialdom in 1,000 years and the most treacherous prime minister in 1,000 years. This treacherous minister was the Prime Minister, Lin Ruofu. Lin Ruofu was born poor and was not the son of a noble family. He had passed the imperial examinations and entered the officialdom, starting out as an appraiser in Suzhou. Soon after, he was transferred to the capital to serve as the registrar of the Zhanshifu, and then to the rank of the 12 guards of the Southern Office. He then entered the imperial censorate as the Zhangyin, and then became a scholar of the Hanlin Academy. In the last new policy, he was transferred to the 6 ministries to be in charge of specific affairs. He became an assistant minister of the Ministry of Appointments, and then a minister. He rose all the way to the head of the civil officials today, the Prime Minister, who was second only to the Emperor and above tens of thousands. People looked closely at the official positions that the Prime Minister had held, only to discover that he had been a civil official, a military official, a minister of poetry, and a supervisor. Although his official position had risen and fallen, he had experienced all of the official circles of the Kingdom of Qing, and his official position had always been slowly but surely rising. Rumor had it that Lin Ruofu had no one to rely on in the inner palace, nor did he have any complicated background or connections. Yet, he was able to rise and fall in the complicated officialdom of Qin Kingdom and never fall. This surprised many people. The Prime Minister appeared to be clear-minded on the surface, but he was sinister and ruthless on the inside, accepting countless bribes. In addition, he had offended many people in the struggle between the civil officials and the nobles, so he had an image of not being close to the nobles and not being loved by the people. However, with his decades of effort, he had long grown countless branches in the Qin Kingdom's civil official system. The big tree had always stood tall and did not fall. From time to time, there would be censors who would impeach the Prime Minister, but there was never any concrete evidence, so they could only drop the matter. The righteous people of Jingdo hated him to the bone and wanted nothing more than to eat his flesh raw. However, in front of the bureaucracy, no one dared to provoke him to his face. In the entire kingdom of Qin, only the emperor could demand the life and power of the prime minister. No one else could. This was the consensus of all the officials. In the entire kingdom of Qin, only the director of the Overwatch Council could spit in the face of the prime minister. No one else had the guts to do so. This was the unanimous opinion of all the nobles. And when the dean spat on the prime minister on the street, he still had to pay the price of 3 years' salary. This punishment was personally given by His Majesty. When people discovered that the emperor's trust in the prime minister had never wavered, those officials and scholars who boasted of their integrity began to despair. At this time, no one expected that the newspaper would publish the news that Prime Minister Lin Ruofu had an illegitimate daughter. It was normal for the patriarch to marry several concubines in any noble family. What if there was only one woman in the backyard? Sorry, I'm really embarrassed to go to the party. However, the customs of the world placed great importance on bloodline and etiquette. Although the prime minister was known to be cunning and ruthless, he had always considered himself to be pure and upright. Unexpectedly, he had an illegitimate daughter outside. This was a loss of virtue. His daughter was already more than 10 years old, but he still hadn't brought her back to the residence, allowing her to live alone outside. As a father, this was proof that he didn't have a benevolent heart. Because the news had come from the imperial palace, it caused a small earthquake in the bureaucracy of the capital. People speculated that His Majesty was tired of the Prime Minister and wanted to replace him. That was why the Imperial Censorate had collectively submitted a petition. Contrary to everyone's expectations, His Majesty personally appeared and suppressed the matter. The matter gradually calmed down, but the Prime Minister's illegitimate daughter became the center of attention. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. He had never imagined that the woman he was about to marry would have such a background, and one so similar to his own. At this time, there was a commotion outside. The siblings knew that the man had returned to the manor. They looked at each other and said nothing more. Fan Xian only used his eyes to ask his sister to take him out for a stroll when she had time. Ruoro nodded slightly. Candles were lit, but the sky outside was not completely dark, so the candlelight seemed very dim. There was a table of sumptuous dishes in the hall, and 5 people sat there. Many servant girls and servants were waiting on them. Fan Xian noticed that Lady Lu was not like the concubines of other families, who first served the patriarch as he ate. Instead, she sat next to the middle-aged man with a calm demeanor. That middle-aged man was his father. Thinking of this, Fan Xian's eyebrows involuntarily furrowed into beautiful little wrinkles. Count Sinan's face was solemn, and his facial features were regular. He wore a 4-inch beard that people of the time liked to wear. One could tell that he had a serious temperament, and that he was serious in speech and manner. They quietly finished their meal. Count Sinan walked in front, and Fan Xian followed behind him, all the way to the study. This was the first time Fan Xian had been alone with his father. He smiled, but was not very excited. In the depths of his heart, he had never truly regarded Count Sinan as his own flesh and blood. Count Sinan looked at the young man in front of him. He looked at the young man's delicate features, and seemed to be lost in thought. After a while, he gently sighed. "You really look like your mother." Fan Xian did not respond, because he had never seen what his mother looked like. But when it came to his father, he had countless questions in his heart. He knew that it was not his place to ask. "How have you been in Danzhou these past few years?" Count Sinan looked at him. There seemed to be some weariness in his eyes, but it still could not hide the traces of his youthful handsomeness. "Not bad. On the way here, I believe that with your personality, you should have found out from Ting Zijing why I wanted you to come to the capital so urgently." "Yes. Do you feel wronged?" "No," Fan Xian replied with a smile. "I just hitched a ride to the capital. I didn't say that I had to marry Miss Lin." As soon as these words left his mouth, the study fell into a deathly silence. After a while, Count Sinan said coldly, "Do you know what it means to marry her?" "It means that, in addition to the Emperor's unfailing favor, Fan Xian will also be able to cling to an incredibly thick thigh in the court." Fan Xian replied sarcastically. Originally, he had no feelings for the middle-aged man in front of him. Logically speaking, he should have been able to keep his cool as a bystander. But when he thought of the fact that Count Sinan was his father, and that he had treated his children's marriage as a political marriage, although he understood and accepted it, it did not mean that he was not angry. But this anger had been well hidden over the past few days. Chapter 45. Good. You're angry at last. The corners of Count Sinan's lips curled up into a smile. "I've been listening to the news from Danzhou, and I thought you weren't one to get angry. Child, you're only 16. If you hide all your emotions in your heart, it will be very painful." "So what?" Fan Xian looked at his father with a strange expression. He was certain of something. "There's something I must tell you, father." "What is it?" "I am not a person who is easy to control." Fan Xian's words were very straightforward. "I have no intention of controlling you, even though you are my son." Count Sinan looked coldly into Fan Xian's eyes, as if he wanted to see a hint of panic in Fan Xian's calm eyes. But the marriage with the Prime Minister's family must be carried out. There is no room for discussion. Fan Xian lowered his head and thought for a moment. Then he looked up and smiled. You can try. But his smile was full of confidence and determination. Count Sinan seemed a little angry. He put his palms on the armrests of his chair, his veins bulging. After a while, he suppressed his anger and laughed coldly. Child, why can't you understand? That Miss Lin is gentle, considerate, educated, and reasonable. She is a good match. Besides, given the status of the Fan family, do we need to rely on marriage to secure our position? Is Emir Lin Ruofu really worth our attention? Fan Xian was a little surprised. He felt that his father was not pretending. But, if even the Prime Minister did not need to care, then why did he want to marry Miss Lin? Was it really just because Miss Lin was so outstanding? No matter what, Fan Xian would not believe this kind of reasoning. Why must we marry her? Fan Xian asked, frowning. Count Sinan smiled. Because Miss Lin's mother is the eldest princess, His Majesty's sister. The eldest princess has never married, but she secretly manages the business of the royal family, providing the entire kingdom of Qing and the palace with an endless supply of money. Fan Xian was extremely shocked, thinking that his future wife was actually the eldest princess' daughter. Didn't that mean the Prime Minister and the eldest princess had an affair or even multiple affairs? No wonder the Prime Minister had been able to climb up so smoothly all these years. It turned out that he was walking the path of a gigolo. Not many people in the world knew about this secret. If his father had not grown up with His Majesty the Emperor, he would not have found out. Fan Xian suddenly realized that his father should not have told him such a deep secret. Count Sinan smiled. You should also know that these words cannot be said outside. Whoever says them will die. So when these words reach your ears, just pretend you didn't hear them. The reason why I'm telling you this secret of the imperial family is so that you can be prepared, in case there's anything inappropriate when you interact with Miss Lin in the future. Fan Xian suddenly thought of what Wu Zhu had told him before, and his expression darkened. He sighed. The royal business that the eldest princess manages, was it originally the business of the Yi family? Not bad. Count Sinan's eyes were filled with affection. He looked at the young man in front of him with admiration. He was surprised that the young man had seen through the truth of the matter so quickly. Her Royal Highness the eldest princess only has this one daughter, and His Majesty has long decided to let the eldest princess manage the royal business. So whoever marries Miss Lin and becomes the son-in-law of Her Royal Highness the eldest princess may become the future owner of the royal business. Having said so much, Count Sinan felt a little tired, but deep down he was also excited. He stood up and stared at Fan Xian. That business belonged to your mother, so you are simply taking back what belongs to you. Count Sinan said slowly, one word at a time. There was a deathly silence. Father, you have great foresight. I am impressed. Fan Xian bowed to his father. Although she is not a princess, she is still a member of the imperial family. Do you think that by doing this, we can take back my mother's business? I think that is a little too arrogant. Of course there is a backup plan. Don't forget, I am an assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue. I am in charge of money. Fan Jian smiled, growing more and more appreciative of the calm mind and attitude of the young man in front of him. Also, there is something I need to tell you. Although Lin Ruofu, that old thief, does not have much of a say in this matter, he still has some doubts about the marriage between our two families. So, I hope that you can perform well in the capital in the near future. Why? Fan Xian was puzzled. Although Lin Ruofu was the prime minister and the head of the civil officials, Fan Xian was well aware of the Fan family's position in the deep lake of the capital. If Lin Ruofu could make such a strong ally, he should be happy. Why would he oppose it? If one considered their status, the young lady seemed to be the same as Fan Xian. Everyone has their own position. Different factions have different things to consider, Fan Jian explained calmly. The Fan family is a large family in the capital, and Lin Ruofu is the head of the civil officials. A secret marriage between the two families is a matter of great importance. Lin Ruofu is hesitant because he is afraid that His Majesty will suspect his intentions, and he is afraid that the young people in the civil system will have second thoughts because of this. Fan Xian sighed and laughed at himself. I thought a lot about it on the way here. It turns out that this is just a hot-headedness, a one-sided idea of the Fan family. Yes, so you have to think of a way to get the young lady of the Lin family to approve of you. Fan Jian smiled, but he did not understand. A hot-headedness. What does that mean? Wrong. Fan Xian pursed his lips into a smile and did not explain further. He changed the subject. Father, there is something I have always been curious about. I don't know if I can ask. Ask away. Forget it. It's getting late. I'll go rest. For some reason, Fan Xian stopped talking and changed the subject. I am not familiar with the capital. Can I have Ting Zijing follow me? Ting Zijing is good at bribing people along the way, but he is only a 4th-level master. Fan Jian frowned. I will arrange a stronger guard for you. The water in the capital is deep. Fan Xian smiled. There is no need. It was not easy to get familiar with him. There is no need to change him. The father and son chatted for a while longer. Seeing that it was late at night, Fan Xian bowed and excused himself. A servant girl was already waiting outside. She passed through a complicated corridor and led him to his bedroom. Chapter 46. Lying on the fragrant bed, his fingers unconsciously stroking the smooth silk surface. Fan Xian was still digesting what his father had said. Although he knew that he would run into some trouble in the capital, he had not expected it to be so troublesome. Before he left just now, he had planned to ask his father about the matter of the Liu family sending people to poison him 4 years ago. But on second thought, perhaps many of the dirty things in the noble families were hidden under that kind of powder. Even if he wanted to forcefully tear it open, it would be of no use. After all, in their conversation earlier, he could feel that his father, whom he had just met, still had some true feelings for him. It seemed that he had been sent to Danzhou because the person who had killed his mother was still in the capital. Thinking of this, a bitter smile appeared on his lips. Was he really going to marry that sickly woman? Now it seemed that he had been scheming against the Lin girl. She really was a pitiful little girl. He decided to find an opportunity to see the Lin girl. Having made this decision, his gaze once again fell on the narrow box that had been placed carelessly in the corner. He was curious as to where the key could be. Jinqi slowly flowed through his body. Because of the journey, he had stopped practicing for dozens of days. Now, he quietly resumed his training. Before entering meditation, Fan Xian thought of his father, whom he had just met, and countless questions welled up in his mind. When Fan Xian first tossed and turned in the Fan Manor in the capital, Count Sinan was also in a daze in his study. This was the first time in 16 years that he had seen Fan Xian. Seeing that clean and beautiful face, Count Sinan sank into some sort of memory, unable to extricate himself for a long time. He muttered, "Little Yi, your child has grown up. He is just like you back then. Young, but he seems to know everything." Chen Pingping was still against him coming to the capital, so I took advantage of his vacation to call Xian back to the capital. Someone promised that the Yi family business would return to him. The light shone on the middle-aged man's solemn face. Don't worry, he said softly. Within the kingdom of Qin, no one would dare harm him. Sunlight shone through the shadows of the clouds, sometimes bright and sometimes dark. The old trees on either side of the road sprouted new branches, gently swaying in the wind. It was already late spring. In the lake at the foot of the mountain, the tender lotus flowers were beginning to bloom. The carriage of Fan Manor moved slowly along the road, with guards in front and behind it. It looked quite imposing. It was very quiet in the carriage. Fan Xian's eyes were half closed. Ruoro was carefully peeling off the skin of a loquat, and then she brought the sweet and sour flesh to her brother's lips. Fan Xian opened his mouth and swallowed. It was so sour that he hurriedly swallowed a few mouthfuls of saliva. Fan Xia's face was full of disbelief and fear as he watched this scene unfold before him. His 15-year-old sister was skilled in chess, the zither, calligraphy, and painting. She was famous among the upper echelons of society in the capital. She had always been arrogant, like an iceberg that wouldn't melt. Countless scholars and nobles sighed in sorrow. Unexpectedly, she would serve Fan Xian with such care, personally peeling loquats for him to eat. Fan Ruoro had no idea that her worshipful expression as she looked at her older brother had fallen into her younger brother's eyes. Subconsciously, she just wanted to make her brother feel better. She thought that her brother must have suffered a lot over the past 10 years in Danzhou. Now that he had finally entered the capital, he was about to marry Miss Lin. In her eyes, there was no woman in the world who could truly match up to her brother. Moreover, Miss Lin was in such a state. Although Miss Fan's talent had long spread far and wide in the capital, in her heart, she was still the little girl who listened to ghost stories in the Danzhou estate. Only Fan Ruoro knew that her brother had thousands of poems and books in his chest. As for the excuses he made in the letter about Grandmaster Chao and Su Wang, Fan Ruoro thought of this and smiled slightly. Looking at her brother in front of her, she thought to herself, "You are obviously talented, but why don't you let me tell others?" Fan Xian also enjoyed the warmth of siblings. He half closed his eyes. He knew that his sister had long guessed that he was the one who wrote the story of the stone, but he was thinking about something else. Fan Xian's situation in the capital was different from what he had expected before he entered the capital. At least Lady Lu seemed to have learned her lesson from the incident 4 years ago, so she was now well behaved. And her rumored arrogant brother seemed to be very obedient to Ruoro's discipline. There was nothing particularly unbearable to Fan Xian. His family was quite happy. Fan Xia looked at Fan Xian's face curiously. He had to admit that his half-brother was much better looking than he was, but he still strongly believed that he was the true young master of the Fan family. This person in front of him was just an outsider. But when he thought of his sister, who had always been as calm as a chrysanthemum flower, and who he had always admired so much, Fan Xia was a little puzzled. He thought to himself, could it be that this Fan Xian really is something special? No one on this street dares to provoke me. The proud Fan Xia looked at the man in front of him, who was 4 years older than him, and said arrogantly, "You've just arrived in the capital. I'll take you around for a couple of days." Fan Xian leaned lazily on the soft cushions, and when he heard this, he couldn't help but laugh. He had originally wanted his sister to take him around the capital to see the sights, but he hadn't expected that Fan Xia, his brother, would show up uninvited and insist on staying in the carriage. "Hey, little guy, why do you have to follow us?" he asked Fan Xia. Fan Xia shouted, "Don't call me little guy, I'm the true young master of the Fan family." Fan Xian was surprised. "Don't you think you're making yourself look bad by shouting like that?" Even if you're afraid of me fighting over your property, you should at least play dirty. He patted his brother's head and continued with a smile, you should learn more from your mother. Fan Xizha looked at the bashful smile on her pretty face, and for some reason, he felt afraid. He shrank back and hid behind Fan Ruoruo, thinking that this guy was too strange. How could he speak so brazenly? As they spoke, the carriage came to a busy part of the capital. It was noon, and there were many people on the street. Restaurants on both sides of the road opened their doors to welcome guests. The sound of yelling and the aroma of food wafted in through the curtains, enticing Fan Xizha to clamor for a meal. Ting Zijing entered the restaurant to make a reservation. Fan Xizha and Ruoruo, under the protection of a few guards, went to a street stall to buy noodles. Fan Xian, however, was half squatting in the restaurant, looking at the decorations on the pillars in the corridor in amazement. The decorations were beautifully drawn and painted with gold. They were unusually dazzling, completely different from what he had seen in the books of his previous life. Two guards were some distance away from him, secretly looking around. At that moment, a middle-aged woman in ordinary clothes approached like a thief, holding a baby. She lowered her voice and asked, "Do you want a book?" "They're all not approved by the 8th Bureau." The scene was familiar to Fan Xian. It was warm, touching, and made him feel at home. He raised his head and asked tenderly, "Is it Japanese or Western?" Chapter 47. The full name of the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council was the head office of the Literary Academy of the Imperial Court. It was similar to the Press Censorship Bureau of the Republic of China. It was responsible for reviewing all official texts. Only articles that passed the 8th Bureau's review were allowed to be published. A few years ago, the head office of the Literary Academy was mostly taken over by the Ministry of Education, but it still had the right to review books privately printed by the people. Therefore, articles that involved depictions of human body art, violent aesthetics, or suggestions for reform without the emperor's permission could not pass the 8th Bureau's review. But no matter the world, people always had a jaw-dropping passion for pornography and politics. So naturally, there were some underground booksellers. Generally, no bookseller dared to touch political books, but romantic novels such as The Pleasure Spell were printed in large quantities and sent to different cities through different channels to reach the hands of the citizens who needed them. The woman carrying the child was undoubtedly the last link in this distribution channel. Everyone in the capital was used to this kind of scene, and no one made a fuss. Even the government turned a blind eye to it, let alone the people who benefited greatly from it. "What did you say, master?" The woman selling banned books obviously did not know about the wonderful existence of AV. Her eyes were wide open in a daze. Fan Xian smiled and asked, "What books do you have?" The middle-aged woman transferred the child to her other hand and took out a large book about 8 inches long. The pages were all red, and it looked really good. Fan Xian was a little impressed. Holding a child and putting such a large book in her clothes did not break the corner. "The most popular novel in the capital recently," the middle-aged woman said mysteriously. Fan Xian took the book. Of course, he would not take the woman's pretense of mystery seriously. He smiled and turned the page, and his expression suddenly became very interesting. There was no name on the cover of the book, but on the title page, there were 4 big words, "I can't think of it." Flipping another page, he saw the following words, "Who knew that this wife was born with a strange hobby?" Once a man gets close to her, he feels his muscles and bones soften, making him feel like he's lying on cotton. Fan Xian's mouth opened wide, and he was speechless for a long time. He could tell at a glance what book it was. This was, of course, The Dream of the Red Chamber that he had copied for his sister. The passage on the title page was from the 21st chapter. It was about Xiao Ping, or soft words to save Jiao Lian. It was about the story of Miss Duo. The middle-aged woman thought that this beautiful young man was moved. She laughed softly and said, "This is only one part of the story. The best part is yet to come." It was said that in his previous life, Fan Xian was always bedridden, and his body was inconvenient. Naturally, it was not convenient for him to trouble his nurse to flip through the book for him, so he could only read the chapter of Dream of the Red Chamber over and over again, reading it countless times. It was all because of Miss Duo's scholarly beauty that his brain was tired countless times. Today, in the middle of the bustling streets of the capital, Fan Xian suddenly saw this familiar passage. How could he not be shocked? He was deeply moved. But he did not understand. Only he and his sister knew about Dream of the Red Chamber. How could it have been printed into a book and sold on the streets? Fan Xian did not even bargain. He took out some silver and paid the bill. He did not feel the slightest pain. The silver had been earned from selling newspapers in Danzhou, and he had spent it extravagantly. After the middle-aged woman walked away with a face full of smiles, Fan Ruoruo led Fan Xizha to the front of the restaurant. Fan Xizha didn't have any dough figurines in his hands, but he did have a candy figurine that he was licking. "What were you doing just now?" Fan Ruoruo asked her brother with a smile. Without waiting for Fan Xian to answer, Fan Xizha sneered. "I saw it. He bought a book from that woman. He didn't even know how to avoid it. Instead, he bought such unsightly things on the street." Fan Ruoruo was startled. She didn't know what was going on. At that moment, Fan Xian wanted to find a place to ask his sister, so he didn't bother talking to the boy. Just then, Ting Zijing came out to report that the private room had been vacated. Fan Xian took Ruoruo's cold hand and walked upstairs. Fan Xizha was startled. He licked the candy figurine and quickly followed. There were many people in the restaurant, but the third floor was very quiet. The private rooms were all booked. It seemed that Ting Zijing's ability to get a private room was not bad. Fan Xian felt that asking his father for him to come was indeed the right decision. Sitting at the table, Fan Xian glanced at Fan Xizha, whose eyes were rolling. He smiled and didn't avoid him. He handed the red page book to his sister. Fan Ruoruo frowned slightly and took it. As soon as she opened the title page, her eyes filled with shock. After flipping through it a few more times, she was even more shocked. She quickly turned her head and explained nervously, "Brother, this is the first time I've seen it too." Fan Xian smiled and comforted her. "I'm not blaming you." He had guessed long ago that his sister would have bound her copy of Dream of the Red Chamber into a book, and that she wouldn't be able to resist sharing it with her close friends. But he thought that Ruoruo's friends were probably the daughters of the royal family. Even if there was some circulation, there was no reason for it to spread to the outside world. It wasn't until today, when he saw this book on the street, that he realized that he had gone to another world, and that he had underestimated the power of the pirates. Fan Ruoruo thought for a bit and remembered something. Last year, she had bound the first 68 chapters of Dream of the Red Chamber together and placed it under a hardwood in her room. One day, Imperial Prince Jing's daughter, Royal Princess Rojia, came to the estate to chat and happened to see this book. After she picked it up, she refused to let it go and said that she wanted to take it back to the estate. But in Fan Ruoruo's heart, this was her brother's work. How could she dare to leave it outside the estate? What if she lost it? So no matter how much Royal Princess Rojia begged and even got angry, she didn't agree. In the end, it was Princess Consort Jing who thought of a way to have a female official come over and copy it for a few days. Now that things had come to this, Fan Ruoruo couldn't stop her, so she let her be. Who knew that this book would spread from 1 to 10, 10 to 100, and eventually became a secret that everyone knew? It was secretly circulated among the manors of the princes and dukes. Then, it spread to the market. No one knows that I wrote it, right? Fan Xian took the book and flipped through it. When he found that the author's name was Chao Shuaqin, he felt slightly comforted. Fan Ruoruo blamed herself, brother, fame and fortune are like floating clouds. I accidentally spread this book, which is already a big mistake. How could I dare to reveal that this book was written by you? Fame and fortune are like floating clouds. Fan Xian smiled awkwardly and rubbed his little sister's head. However, he discovered that he had accidentally messed up the little girl's hair. He hurriedly apologized and explained, since I wrote it, naturally, I was prepared to let the world see it. When he thought of the money he had spent earlier, he felt a bit of heartache inside. I just didn't expect that the pirated merchant would get the first drop of the soup. It's such a waste of money. The siblings talked for a while more, and the waiter began to serve the dishes, so they didn't mention it. At this time, the two of them noticed that Fan Xizha had suddenly broken free from the silence. He looked at Fan Xian with a bit of shock in his eyes. His speech was a bit unclear as he enviously said, "That book was written by you?" Chapter 48. Hearing this, Fan Ruoruo remembered that her conversation with her brother had fallen into his ears. She didn't know if he would bring trouble to her brother if he told Lady Lu. Fan Ruoruo's cold expression changed to one of faint worry. She looked at Fan Xian. Fan Xizha's gaze had changed from shock to admiration. "What's wrong?" Fan Xian looked at him with a strange smile. Fan Xizha finally couldn't stand the seemingly infinite tenderness in his gaze, which was actually infinitely cold. He trembled and said, "I'm just surprised that you wrote this book." Fan Xian was a little puzzled. "You've read this book?" In his impression, in his previous life, if people read Dream of the Red Chamber at the age of 12 and loved reading it, then when they grew up, they would become hipsters or hooligans who deceived female hipsters. No. Fan Xizha quickly shook his head. "I've read some. It's boring." Having said this, he seemed to feel that he had regained some of his dignity. He raised his head a little higher. "It's just that Master read it and said." He thought for a moment, then decided to speak the truth. Master was very impressed. He said that the author's writing style was strange, and that he had a strong heart. These were two very high comments, but Fan Xian didn't blush. He smiled. "So you admire me?" "I admire Master." Fan Xizha thought for a moment. "And Master really likes your book?" Suddenly, his eyes shone with greed. "And even though I don't read it, I know that on the market, this manuscript is sold in separate volumes. Each volume can be sold for 8 taels of silver." He nodded and looked at Fan Xian as if he were looking at an idol. "You can make so much money just by writing a few words. That's amazing. I think I understand why my sister admires you so much." "I didn't make that money." Fan Xian casually corrected him, but he felt strange. Fan Xizha's opinion of him had improved, not because of his poetry, but because of the money he could make from writing. Thinking about it, he understood. His father, Count Sinan, was the Emperor of Qing's personal financial steward. It was no wonder that Fan Xizha was born with a passion for money. Fan Xizha rubbed his hands and said enthusiastically, "But only you can write. If you are willing to earn this money in the future, I can invest in it." Fan Xian sighed. He realized that his younger brother was actually quite naive. It was a pity that he and Fan Xian had a conflict of interest. Although Fan Xian didn't necessarily have any ideas about the Fan family business, Lady Lu's ideas were already deeply rooted. Suddenly, he had a thought and decided to try something. After all, they were brothers connected by blood. It was best to avoid some miserable endings if possible. You still haven't told me why you're following me. Don't you have to go to school today? Fan Xian had already made up his mind, so he was interested in chatting with his half-brother. Although Fan Xizha was young, he wasn't an idiot. He knew that what he had just revealed had made the other party happy, so he put on a cute smile and answered with a trembling voice, because Mom said. Big brother is capable, so she asked me to play with Big brother more. It's always good to be influenced. Fan Xian sighed in his heart. He thought to himself that no one in the world was better at pretending to be cute than him. To think that Fan Xian would actually play it in front of him. It could be said that Fan Xian pretended to be shy, and Confucius analects of Confucius. He knew that Fan Xizha was following him because of Lady Lu's idea. But there was no need for Fan Xian to be friendly. Even if Fan Xian realized that his father didn't just view him as a tool, there was no reason for him to be so reckless. The food arrived. Fan Xian moved his chopsticks like the wind, sweeping them across the plates. The tips of his chopsticks accurately picked up some food from each plate and put it into his mouth. He didn't care about the dumbfounded expressions on the faces of his siblings. After licking his lips and savoring the food for a while, Fan Xian nodded. The food in the capital is really good. Fan Ruoro was very delicate. She casually ate some food, then stopped. She turned her body sideways to read Dream of the Red Chamber. At the table, only Fan Xian and Fan Xizha were eating heartily. The more Fan Xizha ate, the more depressed he became. He was much fatter than Fan Xian, so why couldn't he eat as much or as fast as Fan Xian? The more Fan Ruoro read, the more her brows furrowed. She realized that the bookseller's version of Dream of the Red Chamber wasn't much different from the one she had in her room. It was just that the first page of the title page had purposely extracted Lady Duo's words. She was afraid that the people who read the book in the capital would think that Dream of the Red Chamber was an obscene book. Fan Xian saw her expression and knew what she was angry about. He smiled and put his chopsticks on the side of the fish plate. This is just a marketing ploy. What's there to be angry about? The siblings' voices gradually grew louder. Fan Ruoro vaguely guessed what marketing ploy meant, but Fan Xizha was confused. Take a book for example. Before people buy it, they will definitely flip through it to see what it's about. So the preface, postscript, and the like must be clear. It doesn't necessarily need to be clear about the entire book, but it must be interesting. Fan Xian took a sip of tea and continued, Sister, you're angry because this unscrupulous bookseller put Lady Duo's part at the very front. This part clearly doesn't explain the overall style of the story, but it can easily cause the common people to misunderstand and think that this story is about romance. Am I right? Fan Ruoro opened her eyes wide and nodded. She thought to herself that such fragrant words were being sold as such filthy material. Shouldn't she be angry? But the bookseller must do this. Fan Xian looked at his sister's serious expression and couldn't help but laugh. If I were to do it, I would go even further than they did. This book has 10 chapters, so it should be printed on the title page of the book. Below each chapter, there should be a few lines of the most tempting words. That way, it can make the reader's heart itch. They can only buy the book and read it carefully at home. Like what? Like something like Lady Duo. Then what should I write this time? Fan Ruoro had already understood her brother's meaning. She smiled and pointed to a part of the book. It was chapter 23, Romance of the Western Chamber. The beautiful song of the peony pavilion alarmed the maiden's heart. This time, it was about what happened before the burial of the flower. There was no way to find a phrase that would make one blush. Fan Xian chuckled. Since there's the word beautiful song, of course it's easy to write. If it were me, I would use the part inside. Most of the people in the garden are girls. They are in the chaotic world, innocent and unaffected. They sit or lie down without hiding, laughing without the heart. How could they know what Baoyu was thinking right now? That Baoyu's heart was not at ease, so he was too lazy to stay in the garden. He only fooled around outside, but in a daze, he saw the falling red spell. Then he painted the words sit or lie down without hiding, laughing without the heart, fooling around, and falling red. Fan Ruoro lowered her head to think and found that it was as he had said. It was just some casual words, but with this combination, and the addition of the word beautiful song, it couldn't help but give people some space to think. Her face reddened slightly, and she said in a low voice, "So you often do these kinds of improper things?" Fan Xija, who was listening to the side, was stunned. He gave a thumbs up and said, "Big brother, you really are talented." With a pft, Fan Xian spat out all the tea in his mouth. At that moment, an extremely arrogant voice came from outside. Where did this arrogant person come from? His heart is filled with perversion, and he dares to call himself talented. Chapter 49. The restaurant that the Fan siblings had chosen was called Ishir Tavern. It was one of the wealthiest places in the capital, so every noon, there were always rich officials, scholars, and beautiful women who came here to drink and chat. But no one knew where these scholars earned their money, and why these beautiful women were willing to show their faces in public. In any case, the third floor was quiet, and if one did not have the appropriate status, they would not be able to go up. Because everyone knew that those who could sit at the table on the third floor of Ishir Tavern were people of high status, there were very few conflicts. After all, the capital was not small, but there were many hidden connections in the officialdom. Who knew who was behind them? The one who had just spoken out to refute Fan Xian's theory of peddling things on the street was a true scholar. His name was He Zongwei, and he had always been famous for his talent. He was highly appreciated by the scholars in the capital, so he was a bit arrogant. A few days ago, He Zongwei was reading Dream of the Red Chamber at a friend's place. Although he was very dissatisfied with the meaning of the book, and didn't think there was anything special about the poems, he still admired the author's meticulous effort in writing hundreds of thousands of words. Today, he had come to the restaurant and drunk 2 or 3 cups of yellow wine. He was slightly tipsy, but he heard a few ignorant youths in the room next door talking nonsense about Dream of the Red Chamber. His heart was filled with anger, and he shouted these words. At that moment, the 3 Fan siblings had finished eating and were chatting over tea. Hearing this, Fan Xija thought of his earlier boasting. He thought of how they had criticized Fan Xian, and how he had lost face. He couldn't help but be angry. He was born into the Fan clan, and was extremely noble. He had always run amok on the streets, so he didn't want to be insulted by these pedantic scholars. He lifted the curtain and jumped into the hall on the 3rd floor. Fan Xian thought that since he had just entered the capital, it would be better to keep a low profile. He looked at his sister and asked for her opinion. Fan Ruoro knew what he was thinking. She smiled and shook her head, indicating that Fan Xija wouldn't go too far. Over the past 2 years, Fan Xija had gradually grown older. Under Fan Ruoro's advice, he had become more sensible. Smashing and robbing on the streets had basically disappeared, which was why Fan Xija was so relaxed. Fan Xija rushed into the hall and accurately picked out He Zongwei from the crowd. He walked over to the scholar and snorted. "Were you the one who said that?" "What if I was?" He Zongwei's skin was dark, and his face was prominent. He looked a bit ugly. When he saw someone rushing out from the inner room, he knew that his words had offended someone. However, when he saw the arrogant appearance of the rich and powerful son, his blood rushed to his head. He said coldly, "You're so young, yet you speak so rudely. I wonder which family taught you." Although this gifted scholar he had a wide circle of friends in the capital, he had never met the 12-year-old Fan Xixia, so he was very courageous. Fan Xixia was just going to scold him a little, but when he heard the word upbringing, he remembered how his mother usually scolded him. He shouted angrily, "You bastard, whose family are you?" He Zhongwei had long forgotten his sister's teachings. He jumped up and slapped the man's face. He Zhongwei had never expected that someone would dare to be so tyrannical in a place as elegant as Stone Tavern. He hurriedly took half a step back and dodged the slap. The green scarf on his head was torn, and he looked a bit wretched. The people who sat at the same table as He Zhongwei were all rather renowned scholars, and there was even a noble character among them. When he saw this situation, he couldn't help but be furious and said, "You dare to be so impudent in broad daylight? Do you still have any respect for the law?" "Law?" Fan Xixia snorted. "I am the law." Having said this, he clenched his fists and continued to punch He Zhongwei. Suddenly, a hand reached out from the side and grabbed Fan Xixia's thin wrist. Fan Xixia felt as if his wrist was being held by a red-hot iron band. The pain seeped into his bones. He couldn't help but cry out. "Why aren't you helping me?" he scolded. His bodyguard moved forward to help, but unexpectedly, his figure swayed. Two palms landed on his chest and abdomen, and he retreated. The one who had grabbed Fan Xixia's wrist was the bodyguard of the gloomy man at the table. This bodyguard looked ordinary, but his eyes shone brightly. He was clearly an expert. "Throw this child away. Don't let him disturb Zhongwei's mood," ordered the gloomy man. The expert waved his arm, and Fan Xixia was thrown away like a little chick. Fan Xian had thought that Fan Xixia would at most argue a little. How could he have known that, in the blink of an eye, the situation had become so serious? But he remembered that his younger brother was young and arrogant. Although Ruoro said that he had restrained himself, he still couldn't shake off his little debauchee aura. So he thought it would be fine to let him suffer a little. But he had never expected that there would be a master among them, and that this master would be so ruthless. There was a hidden force hidden in that throw. If it wasn't careful, he would end up with broken bones and vomiting blood. No matter how unbearable Fan Xixia was, it was a bit too much to use such a method on a 12-year-old child. Somehow, Fan Xian was already outside the door. With a flick of his wrist, he had already grabbed Fan Xixia by the collar. Then he used the momentum to turn his body. His right hand twisted clockwise, and Fan Xixia began to spin in a circle. 1 circle, 2 circles, 3 circles. Fan Xixia's body stopped spinning. His eyes were wide open, and it seemed that he still didn't know what had happened. Fan Xian let go of his hand, and with a bitter smile, handed the still dizzy Xixia to Ruoro. He stepped forward, looked at the expert, and said softly, "My younger brother is young," and offended him. "But for you to be so heavy-handed, you have gone too far." The people at the table with the scholar snorted. They didn't know what to say. After all, what the scholar said was true. Only the gloomy young man drank his wine with some self-restraint. He didn't even look at Fan Xian. After straightening his headscarf, He Zhongwei felt that he was in a sorry state. Looking at the beautiful face of the young man in front of him, he felt an inexplicable anger. It seemed that even his smile was repulsive. He said hatefully, "Such a naughty and mischievous child. Why not punish him a little?" Fan Xian ignored him. He smiled warmly at the expert, and then took 2 steps forward. The expert, who had seen Fan Xian twist his wrist and draw a circle to dissipate the force, couldn't help but feel that he was a bit unfathomable. He frowned slightly, and as if to show weakness, he followed Fan Xian's steps and took 2 steps back. The two of them took 2 steps back, and the figure of Fan Ruoruo, who was wearing a full veil, was revealed. Fan Ruoruo was famous in the capital, and the people in the restaurant had long heard of her name. A few of them had even seen her from afar at the prince's poetry competition. Among them were some of the children of high-ranking officials. They were all surprised, and greeted her from a distance. It was only now that the people at the table facing Fan Xian knew who the troublemaker was. They couldn't help but feel a bit anxious. When He Zhongwei saw Fan Ruoruo, his expression changed slightly, as if he wanted to say something. Chapter 50. Ting Zijing hurried up from downstairs. Seeing the scene, he frowned and whispered something into Fan Xian's ear. Only then did Fan Xian realize that the man was Guo Baoquan, the only son of the Minister of Rites, Guo Yu. He was now a palace and had a bit of a reputation. When the gloomy-faced young man saw Fan Ruoruo, his eyes revealed an expression that Fan Xian loathed. I was wondering which family could be so tyrannical. So it's the son of Count Sinan. Count Sinan had always been favored by the emperor, but his official position was only that of an assistant minister, of the 4th rank. Moreover, the children of ordinary officials had no idea of the hidden power of the Fan family. Fan Xian didn't want to make a big deal out of this. After all, it was Fan Xizha who had made the first move. And no matter what, the one who spoke first seemed to be a fan of Dream of the Red Chamber. But hearing such teasing words, he couldn't help but frown. Guo Baoquan's father was a high-ranking official, and he himself was a palace on good terms with the crown prince. As a result, he had developed an arrogant and condescending temperament. When he saw the rumored icy Fan Ruoruo, he became angry and laughed coldly. How laughable! A mere member of the Fan family dares to use his power to oppress others. How disgraceful! He had always called himself a scholar. With a swish, he opened his folding fan with a certain elegance. The scholars next to him were worried. They had offended Count Sinan and didn't know how to deal with it. Hearing Guo Baoquan's words, they hurriedly chimed in, rushing to accuse him of using his power to bully others. None of them felt that they had done anything wrong. Only He Zhongwei, who had caused the trouble, became silent. Refined. Fan Xian saw that the other party's words were threatening, and there was no sign of reconciliation. When he heard that word, he couldn't help but have a hint of mockery in his reply. A scholar cannot be learned without learning, and cannot be learned without ambition. Look at you so-called scholars. Instead of studying in the academy, you come to Yishir Tavern to drink and make merry. What is your aim? Where is your refinement? Apart from Guo Baoquan, the rest of the people at the table were scholars of great talent. When they heard this, their faces changed. A scholar scolded, "Don't think you can use your Fan family's power to speak so impudently." Fan Xian frowned slightly. He had originally thought that his side was not so bold and confident, but seeing the faces of these scholars, he couldn't help but feel disgusted. "You say that the Fan family uses its power to bully others," he said. "I dare not defend myself. On the other hand, all of you are sitting at this table, drinking wine and chatting merrily with the son of the current minister of the imperial court. You are really not afraid of power, and are proud of yourselves. I really admire you." The meaning behind these gentle words couldn't be any clearer. Everyone in the building quietened down. The people sitting at the same table as Guo Baoquan were furious and were about to argue. Guo Baoquan waved his fan twice and was about to open his mouth to teach this young man a lesson. However, Fan Xian's personality was actually a bit strange. He appeared to be gentle, but once he was unhappy, he liked to make others unhappy. Furthermore, he didn't like to give the other party any leeway to retaliate or talk back. So he didn't wait for the minister of the imperial court's son to speak. He pointed at the fan in Guobaokuan's hand and smiled. When I first came to the capital, I saw all the scholars playing around all day. They were all skin and bones, and yet they still had to use a fan to fan themselves. Is that what they call strength of character? That kind of strength of character is something I would never dare to learn. Guobaokuan had been in and out of the royal palace and was friends with the crown prince. He had never been treated like this. He was so angry that he put away the fan in his hand and slammed it on the table. He was so angry that his whole body shook and he couldn't speak. After the kingdom of Qing was ruled by martial law, it placed great importance on the literary style. Young scholars were everywhere in the capital, and at least 70 to 80% of the people in Yishu Tavern were scholars. And these scholars, which one of them didn't have the evil habit of holding a fan? Hearing Fan Xian's loaded words about strength of character, not only did the people at He Zhongwei's table fly into a rage, but everyone else on the third floor also stood up. In reality, Fan Xian had always disliked these so-called scholars. He had a feeling for them, and as someone who had lived 2 lives, he was naturally more free and unrestrained, so he blurted it out. But now, seeing the strange atmosphere in the tavern, he realized that he seemed to have angered everyone. But there was nothing to be afraid of. He smiled and cupped his hands in salute. For some reason, when the scholars saw the radiant smile on this young man's face, they felt that their anger had dissipated by a large half. But Guobaokuan's anger did not subside. Gnashing his teeth, he threw his fan on the table and gave the signal to attack. Scholars belittling each other was just a matter of words, and the 2 sides of this confrontation were the sons of high-ranking officials and aristocratic families. So a dangerous atmosphere began to float in the air. Ting Zijing stared coldly at the expert bodyguard of the Guo family, ready to protect his master at any time. With 2 paw-paw sounds, the 2 silhouettes overlapped each other. The wind from their fists rose in all directions, causing the powerless scholars in the tavern to cry out in alarm. In the battles of the rich and powerful in the capital, the servants and bodyguards fought to the death, while the masters watched from the sidelines in a boring game. Very few people would involve themselves in it. But Fan Xian was very different from the sons of the rich and powerful. After Ting Zijing and the expert bodyguard of the Guo family fought, he quietly moved forward. Amidst the rain of moves, he found a fleeting gap, and stretched out his fist. With a crisp bang, the fierce fighting that everyone had expected came to an abrupt end. Fan Xian withdrew his right hand and stood where he was with a smile, as if he had not moved at all. The expert of the Guo family was already crouching on the ground. The bridge of his nose had been broken by that punch. Blood flowed out, and so did tears. Fan Xian was very satisfied with the effect of this punch. Teacher Fei had taught him correctly. Breaking that spot was a pain that even a 9th-level master could not endure. Guobaokuan saw with his own eyes that his most capable bodyguard had been punched into the ground like a puppy. He turned pale with fright and pointed at Fan Xian. In a trembling voice, he said, You dare to bully me with numbers." Fan Xian glanced at him and shook his head, feeling a little baffled. When it came to fighting, of course they had to do it together. He was not a bored swordsman in the Jianghu. He took Ruoro's hand behind him and confidently walked down the stairs. It never occurred to him that his previous actions were completely against some of the established rules of this world. Chapter 51. Everyone in the building was dumbstruck and speechless. They had seen fights before, but they had never seen a son of a noble family enter the fray. Even if someone had been lucky enough to see such a rare scene, they had probably never seen such a fair and square 2-on-1 fight. Even Ting Zijing was a little depressed. Although he was much weaker than the master of the Guo family, the young master's actions had made him lose face. Suddenly, his heart skipped a beat. He thought of the comical scene from before. How could the young master see through such a complicated situation so clearly? Furthermore, that punch seemed to be messing around, but in reality, the power and angle were terrifyingly accurate. When he looked at Fan Xian again, there was a hint of awe and amazement in his eyes. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, the Fan family was about to go downstairs when a private room in the corner of the building was pushed open. A few people came out, presumably having heard the argument outside and had come out to see what was going on. One of them, dressed in luxurious clothing, looked at Fan Ruoruo, and his eyes brightened. He came forward and bowed. "Sister Ruoruo, it's rare to see you out of the manor." The newcomer was handsome, with thick eyebrows and clear eyes, a straight nose and thin lips. He looked like a fine man. Fan Ruoruo bowed in surprise. "The Crown Prince is here too." She quickly introduced Fan Xian to the man. Fan Xian had not expected this to be the Crown Prince of Prince Jing, who was on good terms with his family. Prince Jing and the Fan family had always been on good terms, so he had a good understanding of their family. As soon as Fan Ruoruo introduced him, the Crown Prince immediately guessed who Fan Xian was, and couldn't help but feel slightly surprised. He saw that Fan Xian's speech was neither servile nor overbearing, and that there was an indescribable self-confidence in his bones. The smile on his face was warm and amiable, and he couldn't help but feel very comfortable. At that moment, the palace, Guo Baoquan, also came to pay his respects to the Crown Prince. Someone else told the Crown Prince about the small conflict between the Guo and Fan families. After hearing this, the Crown Prince was greatly interested. He asked Fan Xian, "Brother, you seem to have a problem with scholars." "Everyone can study, and everyone is a scholar," Fan Xian replied, bowing to the Crown Prince. In his mind, there was no concept of class division in this era, and he didn't think that reading a few stereotyped sentences would make him a person who transcended the common people of industry and commerce. "I also study, how would I dare to have an opinion about scholars? It's just that," he smiled and continued, "I just have a problem with the so-called gifted scholars." As soon as he said this, everyone in the building revealed a curious expression. They wanted to see what this disciple of a noble family who used black boxing would say. Even the Crown Prince asked with great interest, "Brother, why do you look down on the so-called gifted scholars?" The Crown Prince was rather polite, but because Fan Xian had not formally acknowledged his ancestry, he could only call him brother and not mention anything else. At least, he did not mention his surname. Fan Xian understood the rules of this society very well, and was not angry at all. He smiled and explained, "The reason why I have a problem with scholars is because I feel that there is something wrong with the way things are nowadays. It seems that if a scholar is willing to go to a brothel, he will become a scholar. I'm afraid this scholar has too much cosmetics and too little scholarly air. It won't be beneficial to the country, but it will benefit those women instead." Although his words were somewhat bitter, they were not malicious. It sounded more like a joke. The Crown Prince's heir laughed and the people in the restaurant also laughed. This matter was considered to have been resolved. After all, in the eyes of others, this young master of the Fan family, who had come out of nowhere, seemed to have some friendship with the Crown Prince. As for Guo Baoquan's side, it seemed that they were no match for Fan Xian in a fight, and they were no match for him in an argument either. They could only reluctantly drop the matter. The Crown Prince invited Fan Xian in for a drink, but Fan Xian politely declined on the pretext of returning to his manor. They only agreed to meet again the next day, and the Fan family left the restaurant. Just as they left the restaurant and were about to get into the carriage, the scholar named He Zhongwei hurried down. He looked into Fan Xian's eyes and very sincerely thanked him. "What are you thanking me for?" Fan Xian asked with a smile. He Zhongwei replied with a smile, "I have always looked down on the rich and powerful, and I have always prided myself on this. Today, you have pointed it out, and I now know that I just like this feeling. Deep in my bones, I can't get rid of those stereotypes. Fan Xian frowned slightly. He felt that this person's attitude had changed a little too quickly. Although he did not like this seemingly honest scholar, the reason for the conflict was that the other party was fighting for him, the author of Dream of the Red Chamber. Therefore, he smiled and explained, everyone has a cowardly part in their bodies. It's just that they need certain things to force this part out. This is the so-called small part under the scholar's robe. Today, I was just speaking nonsense. I hope you don't take offense. The small part under the scholar's robe. He Zhongwei seemed to be thinking about something. He came to his senses and bowed deeply to Fan Ruoruo, who was standing next to Fan Xian. He then turned around and went upstairs without looking back. Fan Xian saw that the dark-skinned scholar's face seemed to be a little red, and only then did he know what was going on. He looked at his sister with a face full of ridicule, but Fan Ruoruo's face was calm, as if the dark-skinned scholar had never been there. Knowing that He Zhongwei's love was unrequited, Fan Xian did not have much sympathy. In his plans, his sister's future husband did not necessarily have to be a noble, but he had to be someone that his sister liked. After Fan Xian left, Guo Baoquan, He Zhongwei, and the other scholars at the table also left the building. The third floor of the Stone Tavern gradually returned to normal, but the guests at the other tables were still talking about the young master from Fan Manor. They had never heard of such a person in Count Sinan's household, and they all guessed that he was a cousin of Miss Fan. Crown Prince Jing naturally knew of Fan Xian's identity, but he could not speak to the idle people outside the room. He poured himself a cup of wine and slowly drank it. He faintly sighed. Everyone says that the Crown Prince loves literature, and often associates with the upper class. Now it seems that among the people he associates with, there is not a single decent talent. An advisor pondered for a moment. He Zhongwei is a student of Tsing Wenxiang. He will definitely pass the imperial examinations next year. I wonder what he is like. Crown Prince Jing shook his head. This He Zhongwei is talented, but his temperament is. He had actually heard the conversation outside from the side room. At this time, he thought of the comment about his strength of character. He laughed and said, his strength of character is indeed lacking. The advisor also laughed. That illegitimate child that Master Fan has been hiding for over 10 years is quite interesting. Crown Prince Jing patted the fan in his hand. He was about to praise Fan Xian when he suddenly remembered Fan Xian's teasing words. He quickly put the fan back on the table and laughed. That Guo Baoquan relies on his father's power, and because he is on good terms with the Crown Prince, he does not care about Fan Manor. It is not easy for such a mediocre person to survive until now. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.